Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. In the year 911 AD, a Viking warlord named Rollo knelt before the Archbishop of Rouen and received the waters of Christian baptism. He traded his Thor's hammer for a cross. His reputation as a pagan terror for legitimacy as a Christian duke. Within 5 generations, his descendants would rule England, conquer Sicily, carve kingdoms from the Holy Land itself, and transform the face of medieval Europe forever. The price they paid was their very identity. By the time their grandchildren's grandchildren drew breath, the word Norman would become a memory, absorbed completely into the peoples they had conquered. They burned so bright, so fast, that they consumed themselves in their own fire. How does a people emerge from nowhere, reshape an entire continent, and then vanish as though they never existed? What drives men to trade everything familiar, every connection to home and heritage, for glory that outlasts them by centuries while their names fade into footnotes? Tonight, we will follow the Normans from their origins as Viking raiders, through their stunning metamorphosis into history's most successful conquerors, watching as they build kingdoms that endure while their own culture dissolves, like morning frost in sunlight. We will stand on the beaches of Normandy, fight at Hastings, storm the walls of Palermo and Antioch, and finally witness the strange fate of a people who won everything except permanence. Before we get started, I'd really appreciate your like and subscription if you enjoy what you see here. It's the primary way I know to keep creating. Thank you so much for that support. I also find it fascinating to connect with viewers worldwide, so please drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and your local time. Let the sands of time shift beneath you, carrying you backward to the coast of northern France in the late 900s AD, where longships beach on riverbanks and the line between Viking and Frank grows blurred in the morning mist. Wolves from the north, they came in dragon ships, 70 oars churning dark water into foam. For over a century, the Northmen had terrorized the coasts and rivers of Western Europe. These weren't the romantic Vikings of later imagination, noble explorers seeking new lands. They were hard men from hard places. Norway and Denmark, where thin soil and bitter winters bred a culture that valued silver over mercy and reputation over life itself. A man's worth was measured by the rings on his arms, the length of his ship, and the fear his name inspired in distant lands. The Frankish Empire, that vast realm Charlemagne had forged, was fracturing like rotten timber. His grandsons had divided his inheritance into squabbling kingdoms, each too weak to mount effective defence, each rich enough to make tempting targets. Monasteries held accumulated wealth from centuries of donations. Cities clustered along rivers that served as highways directly into the heart of Christian Europe. The Vikings learned to read this landscape like a hunter reads tracks in snow. They developed a terrible efficiency. A raid wasn't random violence but calculated enterprise. Ships would appear at dawn, disgorge warriors who struck with practiced speed, and vanish before local lords could muster response. Monasteries burned. Priests died clutching golden crosses. The survivors, when there were survivors, paid tribute to ensure the raiders wouldn't return next season. Except they always returned. The silver flowed north like a river running uphill. The Franks called them Northmen, Normanni in Latin. The Anglo-Saxons called them Danes, regardless of origin. The Irish called them dark foreigners and fair foreigners, distinguishing Norwegian from Danish Vikings by hair colour, as though it mattered when both came to kill and take. The raiders themselves had no unified identity. They owed loyalty to jarls and kings back home, to ship crews and raiding companies, but not to anything as abstract as ethnicity or nation. Among these wolves moved a particularly fierce predator named Rollo. The sources disagree about his origins. Some say Norway, others Denmark. The details blur across centuries, but the core truth remains sharp as a blade's edge. Rollo commanded enough men and ships to threaten Francia itself. He sailed up the Seine in the year 885, besieging Paris for nearly a year. The city held, barely, its walls, and the winter breaking his assault, where armed resistance had failed. But Rollo learned from failure. He recognized something the other raiders missed. The Franks were weak, yes, divided and vulnerable, but they possessed something worth more than silver: legitimacy. Land. The weight of Rome's ghost pressing down through centuries of Christian tradition. A Viking could take silver and slaves, but he would always remain an outsider, a wolf at the gate. Rollo wanted inside the walls. He continued raiding through the early 900s, his power growing, his threat to Francia becoming existential. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, faced an impossible choice. He could spend his reign fighting an enemy he couldn't defeat, watching his kingdom bled white by raiders who vanished like smoke whenever cornered. Or he could do something radical, something that would have made his great-great-grandfather Charlemagne rage in his tomb. He could turn the wolf into a shepherd. Rollo's bargain. The meeting took place at St. Clair-sur-Epte, a small settlement on the border of Frankish territory, in the autumn of 911 AD. Picture the scene. On one side, King Charles the Simple with his bishops and nobles, men in fine cloth and polished mail, carrying the weight of Frankish tradition, speaking for what remained of Charlemagne's empire. On the other, Rollo with his raiders, scarred and sun-weathered, smelling of salt spray and leather, worshipping gods the Christians called demons. Two worlds meeting in a river valley, neither trusting the other, both desperate enough to negotiate. The terms Charles proposed were straightforward and extraordinary in equal measure. Rollo would receive land, a vast territory along the Seine, centred on the city of Rouen. This land would be his to rule, to pass to his heirs, recognised as legitimate by the Frankish crown. In exchange, Rollo would convert to Christianity, swear fealty to King Charles as his vassal, and defend this territory against other Vikings. The raider would become the guard dog. The destroyer would become the protector. Consider what this meant for Rollo. He would gain what every Viking warlord dreamed of: permanent land, legitimacy, a legacy beyond silver and reputation. No more winters wondering if his men would follow him on another raid. No more depending on luck and the summer sailing season. But the price was steep, steeper than gold or blood. He would bend the knee to a Christian king. He would renounce Thor and Odin for the White Christ. He would become, in the eyes of many Vikings, something worse than dead. He would become tame. The ceremony itself became legend, though details vary in the telling. Rollo received baptism at Rouen Cathedral. The archbishop poured holy water over his head, while Frankish nobles watched, some relieved, others appalled that they were legitimizing a pagan butcher. Rollo was given the Christian name Robert, though history remembers him by his Norse name. He swore oaths of fealty to King Charles, promising to defend this land as a Christian duke. One story, perhaps apocryphal but revealing in its persistence, claims that when Rollo was required to kiss King Charles's foot as a sign of submission, he refused. Instead, he ordered one of his men to perform the gesture. This man, rather than kneeling, grabbed the king's foot and lifted it to his mouth, toppling Charles backward in the process. The Franks gasped in outrage. Rollo's men laughed. Whether true or not, the tale captures something essential. Rollo would accept Christianity and legitimacy, but he would not become French. He would remain himself, transformed but not conquered. The land he received became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. It wasn't empty territory. Frankish nobles and peasants already lived there, their own settlements, but decades of Viking raids had depopulated much of the region, and what Rollo did next proved his genius. He didn't drive out the Franks or rule as a foreign occupier. He invited more Norsemen to settle. Yes, warriors and farmers from Scandinavia looking for land, but he also married Gisla, daughter of King Charles, binding himself to Frankish nobility. He learned to speak French. He built churches instead of burning them. He administered justice using Frankish law while maintaining Norse military traditions. Within a generation, something unprecedented was happening in Normandy. The Norse settlers were intermarrying with Frankish women. They were adopting the French language, though their dialect carried Norse influences. They were becoming Christian, genuinely Christian, with a convert's fervour that often exceeds the faith of those born into belief. But they kept their military culture, their love of horses and heavy cavalry, their organisational discipline, their ambition. The transformation wasn't instant or smooth. Some Norsemen rejected Christianity and returned to the old ways, continuing to raid. Rollo himself struggled with his new identity. Sources suggest he made offerings to both Christian and pagan gods, hedging his spiritual bets. But he held his territory, fought off rival Vikings, and established a dynasty that would change the world. His son, William Longsword, continued this synthesis. His grandson, Richard the Fearless, solidified Norman identity as something distinct from both Frank and Norse. By the early 1100s AD, Normandy had become a powerhouse, a compact territory with a military culture unmatched in Western Europe. They spoke French but with Norse words mixed in. They followed Christian law but maintained Norse ideas about honour and warfare. They had become something new. The Vikings who became Normans gained civilization, legitimacy, and permanence. They gained a future beyond the next raid. But they lost the freedom of the open sea, the wild identity of pagan warriors answering to no god but their own courage. They gained everything their ancestors had envied about settled kingdoms. They lost the very thing that had made them Vikings. This was the bargain at the heart of Norman identity: transformation for survival, civilization for power, the abandonment of roots for the promise of legacy. It worked better than anyone could have imagined. The forging of a new people. You are 14 years old, the son of a minor Norman lord, and today you begin training for knighthood. The year is 980 AD, 3 generations after Rollo's baptism. You wake in a manor house that your great-grandfather would have called impossibly soft. Wooden walls instead of a longship's planks, a bed instead of a sleeping bench. You speak French with your mother, though your father sometimes lapses into Old Norse when he drinks, singing songs about gods your family no longer worships. You walk to the training yard as dawn breaks cold over the Norman hills. Your breath steams in the autumn air. Other boys are already there, sons of nobles like yourself, ranging from 12 to 18 years old. You all wear simple tunics and leather shoes, though by the end of training, you will be covered in mud and blood. Your instructor is a scarred veteran named Tancred, a man who fought in your grandfather's wars against the Bretons. He walks through your formation, examining each boy like a farmer examining livestock. When he reaches you, he stops. You smell wine on his breath, see the white marks of old blade cuts across his arms. A knight, he says, his voice rough as stone grinding stone, is not born, he is made. Your grandfather's grandfather came from the north, with nothing but a sword and a dragon ship. Now you train to defend what he won. Remember that. Every moment of pain today is purchased with the blood he spent yesterday. The training begins. First, you run. Miles of running through Norman fields, following paths that wind between villages. Your ancestors raided before they became your ancestors. Your lungs burn, your legs shake. When you want to stop, Tancred is there, pushing you forward, shouting that a knight who cannot run cannot fight when his horse falls. Then comes the real work. You learn to fight on foot with sword and shield. The practice swords are wood, but they break bones if you fail to block. You learn that combat is not heroic poetry, but geometry and timing, angles and leverage. You learn that courage without skill gets you killed, but skill without courage means you hesitate, and hesitation kills faster than cowardice. You learn to ride. The Normans have perfected something new in warfare, the mounted charge. Viking raiders fought on foot, using horses only for transportation. The Franks had cavalry, but nothing like what the Normans developed. You learn to control a warhorse with your knees because your hands will hold weapons. You learn to couch a lance, bracing it under your arm so the horse's momentum drives the point home. You learn that a charging knight is not a man on a horse, but a unified weapon weighing 1,000 pounds, moving at the speed of thunder. The training consumes years of your life. You learn courtly manners, how to speak to lords and ladies, because a knight is not merely a warrior, but a member of the nobility. You learn to read Latin, at least enough to follow mass and sign your name. You learn to hunt, which is both sport and practice for warfare. You learn to survive on campaign, how to live on stale bread and rainwater when supply trains fail. You also learn history, though not from books. The old men tell stories around evening fires. They speak of Rollo's bargain, how the first Normans traded their freedom for legitimacy. They speak of battles against Vikings who refused to convert, how strange it felt to fight men who worshipped the same gods their grandfathers had served. They speak of the land across the narrow sea, England, where another group of Northmen had settled centuries earlier and grown soft with success. Remember what we are, your father tells you one night, examining your bruised face after a day of brutal training. We are not Franks, though we speak their language. We are not Norsemen, though their blood flows in our veins. We are Normans. We take the best of both worlds and forge something stronger than either. You understand, in that moment, that you are part of something unprecedented in history. Your people emerge from violence and chaos, from the collision of two incompatible cultures, and instead of destroying each other, they created something new. You are a Christian who descends from pagans. You are a French speaker with Norse bones. You are a knight trained in cavalry tactics your Viking ancestors would have considered cowardly, fighting from horseback instead of shield to shield on foot. You are Norman. And that word, still new, still being defined, will soon inspire fear across 3 continents. The Bastard Duke. In the autumn of 1027 AD, a young Norman nobleman named Robert watched his father ride away to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. Robert the Magnificent, Duke of Normandy, had a problem that consumed him. He had fathered a son, William, with a woman named Herleva, daughter of a tanner from the town of Falaise. Herleva was not his wife. There would be no wife. Robert had loved her, perhaps still loved her, but the political realities of Norman nobility made their union impossible. Their son was illegitimate, a bastard in the eyes of church and law. Robert knew he might not return from Jerusalem. The journey was perilous, the destination fever-ridden. So before he left, he did something extraordinary. He assembled the Norman nobles and made them swear oaths, recognizing William, not yet 10 years old, as his heir. The nobles swore, because refusing a duke to his face was suicidal. But they smiled as they spoke their vows, already calculating. Robert died in Nicaea in 1035 AD, his pilgrimage complete, but his homecoming denied by disease. The news reached Normandy months later. William was 8 years old, alone, legitimate by oath, but bastard by birth, ruling a duchy full of ambitious men who had sworn loyalty to a dead duke. What followed was chaos. 3 of William's guardians died violently within a few years, murdered by rivals who saw opportunity in a child's weakness. Norman nobles rose in rebellion, some because they wanted the duchy for themselves, others because they genuinely believed a bastard child couldn't rule, still others simply because chaos offered chances for profit. The boy duke survived by luck, by the loyalty of a few good men, and by learning to be hard in ways that would have impressed his Viking ancestors. Picture William in his early teens, knowing that men were plotting his death, that his mother's low birth would always be a weapon his enemies wielded, that he could trust almost no one. He learned to sleep lightly. He learned to see betrayal coming in a man's eyes before the dagger appeared. He learned that mercy was a luxury and reputation mattered more than love. The decisive moment came at Vallis Dunes in 1042 AD. A coalition of rebellious Norman barons brought an army to sweep the bastard duke away. William was 15 years old. He could have fled, sought protection in France or elsewhere, accepted that he was too young, too weak, too stained by illegitimate birth to hold his inheritance. Instead, he fought. With King Henry of France's help, he met the rebel army in open battle. The fighting was vicious, Norman against Norman, the civil war that could have shattered Rollo's legacy before it truly flowered. William fought in the front ranks, his banner visible, his survival necessary for his side's morale. The rebels broke, the survivors fled, or submitted. From that day forward, no one called him bastard to his face. They might whisper it, might use it to diminish him in foreign courts, but in Normandy, William commanded respect earned in blood. He spent the next decade consolidating power, crushing rebellion, building alliances through marriage and fear. He married Matilda of Flanders, a noblewoman whose father initially refused the match because of William's illegitimate birth. William's response was to ride to Flanders and drag Matilda by her hair. Or so the story goes. Whether true or exaggerated, they married, and Matilda became one of his strongest allies. By 1060 AD, William was no longer the frightened bastard child hiding from assassins. He was Duke of Normandy, uncontested, having transformed his greatest weakness into savage strength. Men who once mocked his birth now feared his anger. The lessons of his childhood, the violence and paranoia and constant threat, had forged him into something terrible and magnificent. But William looked across the narrow sea to England and saw something that consumed his thoughts. He saw a crown he believed belonged to him. And unlike his father, who dreamed of Jerusalem, William's ambitions focused on conquest far closer to home. The boy who survived assassination would become the man who conquered a kingdom. The bastard would become a king, blood on the tournament field. In the decades after William's rise to power, Norman culture crystallized into something unique and fearsome. The tournament became the crucible where this culture expressed itself most purely. These weren't the elaborate pageants of later centuries with their rules and courtesy. Early Norman tournaments were barely organized warfare, mass melees, where knights on horseback charged in formation, seeking to unhorse opponents and win ransoms from captured nobles. Men died, horses screamed, the ground churned to mud under thousands of hooves. Picture a field in Normandy on a spring morning, 1058 AD. 200 knights gather, divided into competing teams. They wear mail hauberks that reach their knees, conical helmets with nose guards, and carry kite-shaped shields painted with devices identifying their houses. The crowd of spectators, nobles and commoners alike, press close to the boundaries, eager for violence. A horn sounds. The knights lower their lances and charge. The impact when the two forces meet sounds like thunder, mixed with the ringing of a massive bell. Lances shatter against shields. Horses collide and fall, throwing riders who must fight on foot or be trampled. The melee becomes chaos, individual duels, and knots of combat spreading across acres. This is where Norman military superiority was born. In these brutal competitions that were as much training as sport, they perfected the coordinated cavalry charge, something no other European power had mastered to such degree. They learned to fight as a unit, maintaining formation even in the chaos of impact, supporting each other rather than dissolving into individual glory-seeking. The Franks had knights, the Germans had knights, but Norman knights were something else, a precision instrument of organized violence. The culture surrounding this military excellence was equally distinctive. Norman nobles spoke constantly of honor, but their definition of honor was pragmatic. Honor meant keeping your oath, not from moral principle, but because a man whose word meant nothing couldn't make alliances. Honor meant reputation for courage and skill, because fear was a weapon as valuable as a sword. Honor meant providing for your warriors, because loyalty followed silver as surely as shadow follows light. They were profoundly ambitious, these Normans, in ways that made their French cousins uncomfortable. A Norman knight was expected to seek glory, to expand his holdings, to rise higher than his birth suggested possible. This was, after all, a culture founded by a Viking who talked his way into a duchy. Advancement through courage and cunning wasn't shameful but admirable. The phrase, "fortune favours the bold," could have been their motto. Yet alongside this aggressive ambition lived genuine piety. The Normans built churches with the same enthusiasm they built castles. They endowed monasteries, went on pilgrimages, and worried about their souls with convert fervour. This wasn't hypocrisy, though it might seem contradictory. They believed absolutely that God rewarded courage and punished cowardice, that victory in battle was divine judgment, that conquest was holy work if done in Christ's name. This combination, military excellence, mixed with religious conviction and burning ambition, made them unstoppable. And in 1060 AD, all of this culture, all of this carefully forged identity, focused on a single objective across the narrow sea, the promise across the Channel. Edward the Confessor, King of England, died on January 5th, 1066 AD, without leaving an heir. England, in 1066, was wealthy beyond Norman dreams. Centuries of relative peace had allowed trade to flourish, cities to grow, monasteries to accumulate treasures. The land was rich, the people numerous, the kingdom organised with administrative sophistication Normandy couldn't match. And it was vulnerable, torn between competing claims to the throne. The roots of the crisis stretched back decades. Edward had spent his youth in Norman exile, while Danish kings ruled England. He spoke French better than English, felt more comfortable with Norman customs than Anglo-Saxon traditions. When he finally gained England's throne in 1042, he brought Norman advisors and favourites, offending his English nobles. Among his visitors was his cousin William, Duke of Normandy, who came to England in 1051 or 1052. What passed between them remains unclear, lost to history's shadows. But William would later claim, loudly and repeatedly, that Edward promised him the English throne. Edward had no children. He needed an heir. William, related through Edward's mother Emma, had legitimate claim by blood. Also, William would argue. The other key moment came in 1064, when Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, and the most powerful nobleman in England, shipwrecked on the Norman coast. Again, sources disagree about what followed. William's version, shown in the Bayeux tapestry, depicts Harold swearing a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne. Harold's version, if he gave one that survived, is lost. We know only that Harold returned to England, and 2 years later, everything exploded. When Edward died, England needed a king immediately. Danish invasion threatened from the north. Norwegian raiders watched for opportunity. A kingdom without a king was a kingdom inviting conquest. The Witan, England's Council of Nobles, chose Harold Godwinson. He was English, powerful, experienced in warfare, and physically in England. He was crowned the day after Edward's funeral, January 6, 1066. The speed of Harold's coronation suggests desperation. It also suggests he knew what storm was coming. William received news of Edward's death and Harold's coronation with cold fury. In his mind, he had been promised England by its rightful king. In his mind, Harold had sworn on sacred relics to support his claim. Now both Edward and Harold had betrayed him. William's response was calculated and brilliant. He didn't immediately raise an army and invade like a Viking raider. He built legitimacy first. He sent envoys to Pope Alexander II, presenting his case. Edward had promised him England. Harold had sworn oaths. The English had wrongfully given the crown to an oath-breaker. The Pope, for reasons both spiritual and political, sided with William, sending a papal banner to bless the invasion. Harold was declared excommunicate. William's conquest would be a holy crusade. This papal support transformed everything. Norman nobles, who might have been reluctant to follow their duke on a risky invasion, now saw opportunity sanctified by God. Knights from across France volunteered, drawn by promises of English land and heavenly reward. William built not just an army but a coalition, diverse forces united under his command and the Pope's blessing. Harold, watching from England, understood his peril. He had broken sacred oaths, or so William claimed. He faced invasion blessed by the Pope himself, and his position was worse than William knew, because another storm gathered in the north. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, believed he had his own claim to England. 2 separate invasions would strike in the same year. The stage was set for one of history's pivotal moments. 2 men, both named Harold, both commanding armies, both claiming rightful kingship. One would be dead before autumn ended, the other would be King of England, launching a dynasty that would reshape medieval Europe. But in the spring of 1066, as William gathered his forces, the outcome remained uncertain, balanced on the edge of a blade, preparing the storm. Through the spring and summer of 1066, the Norman coast buzzed with activity, unlike anything seen since the Roman Empire. William needed ships, hundreds of ships, to carry perhaps 7,000 men, plus horses and supplies across the Channel. Normandy's existing vessels wouldn't suffice. He ordered new construction on a massive scale. Every beach, every inlet suitable for shipbuilding, echoed with axes biting wood and hammers driving pegs. The Bayeux tapestry shows trees being felled, planks being shaped, vessels taking form along the shore like a fleet summoned from timber by will alone. These weren't Viking longships. Though they descended from that tradition, they were broader, deeper, built to carry horses as well as warriors. Each horse needed space, needed restraints to prevent panic during the crossing. Each knight needed his equipment: mail armor, weapons, shield, saddle, spare clothing. Archers needed arrows by the thousands. Everyone needed food for the journey and the days after landing before supply lines could be established. The logistics alone should have broken William's resolve. Feeding 7,000 men while they waited for favourable winds meant accumulating stores from across Normandy and beyond. Keeping the army together, preventing desertions and maintaining discipline required constant attention. Many of the volunteers weren't William's sworn vassals, but adventurers from across France, Brittany, Flanders, even farther afield. They followed promises of English land, but promises don't feed empty stomachs during endless waiting. William spent these months everywhere at once, or so it must have seemed. He rode between the beaches, inspecting construction, ensuring quality. He met with nobles, confirming their commitments, settling disputes before violence erupted. He reviewed troops, maintained morale, projected confidence he might not always have felt. Most importantly, he held the coalition together through sheer force of personality and careful management. His Duchess, Matilda, supported the endeavour despite being pregnant. She provided funding from her own resources. She maintained the civil administration of Normandy while William focused on invasion. Later accounts suggest she even commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry, that magnificent propaganda piece showing William's righteousness and Harold's treachery in scenes stitched by Norman craftswomen. But nature cared nothing for William's plans or Matilda's support. The winds blew stubbornly from the north, making crossing impossible. Day after day, week after week, William waited. His supplies diminished. His men grew restless. Across the Channel, Harold knew invasion was coming, but not when. He mobilised England's feared, the militia army, keeping them under arms through the summer. But peasants can't stand guard indefinitely. They have harvests to gather, families to feed. Harold faced an impossible calculation: keep the feared mobilised and watch England's harvest rot in the fields, dismiss them and risk being caught unprepared when William finally sailed. By early September, Harold made his choice. The fired went home. The southern coast remained defended only by professional troops, fewer in number, watching empty horizons. In Normandy, William prayed for wind. His priests held masses, seeking divine favour. His men grew impatient. Some began to whisper that God didn't favour this invasion, that the persistent north winds were a sign to abandon the enterprise. William silenced such talk with a combination of threats and reassurances. The wind would turn, God would provide. Victory was certain because their cause was righteous. He moved his fleet from Dives-sur-Mer to St. Valery-sur-Somme, positioning closer to England, reducing the crossing distance. Still the winds blew north. The waiting continued. Men died of disease in the crowded camps. Horses sickened and had to be replaced. The entire endeavour balanced on a knife's edge, success or catastrophic failure determined by weather patterns. William had committed everything to this invasion: his reputation, his treasury, his duchy's future. If he failed, if he returned to Normandy without attempting the crossing, his nobles would see weakness. His enemies would strike. His entire reign might collapse, but if he attempted crossing in unfavourable winds, his fleet would scatter or sink. The army would drown. Failure, either way, meant destruction. So he waited, projecting confidence, trusting in God and his own judgment. The wind would turn. It had to turn. The wind turns. On the night of September 27th, 1066, the wind shifted. The camp at St. Valery-sur-Somme stirred as men noticed the change. North winds that had pinned the fleet to shore for weeks gradually stilled, then reversed. South winds, gentle at first, began to blow. Watchmen reported to commanders. Commanders reported to William. By dawn, every man in the Norman army knew the wind had turned. There was no time for hesitation. William ordered immediate embarkation. The fleet had to sail with this wind while it held. 700 ships, perhaps more, were dragged into the waves. Horses, terrified by the unfamiliar motion, were coaxed aboard and secured. Men loaded supplies, equipment, weapons. The beach became organized chaos. Thousands of individuals executing a plan rehearsed through months of waiting. William's own ship, the Mora, led the fleet. Matilda had given him this vessel, specially built, carrying a lantern at its mast to guide the following ships through darkness. At the bow, a carved figure held a horn to his lips and an arrow pointed toward England, as though the ship itself announced holy invasion. The crossing began in daylight, but continued through the night. Picture the scene. Hundreds of vessels spreading across dark water, guided by lanterns, by stars, by prayer. Men who had waited months for this moment now faced the reality of leaving land behind, trusting their lives to timber and cloth, and the same God who had finally granted favourable winds. Some ships carried warriors too excited to sleep, nervous energy finding release in songs and boasts. Other ships carried men who knelt in prayer, recognising that by morning they would be either conquerors or corpses on an English beach. The crossing took roughly 12 hours. There were no storms, no disasters. The wind held steady. The sea remained manageable. The fleet stayed mostly together. It seemed like divine endorsement, proof that God truly blessed their enterprise. When dawn broke on September 28th, the Norman ships approached the English coast near Pevensey. The beach was empty. No English army waited in formation. No arrows fell like rain as the Normans approached. Harold and his professional troops were far to the north, dealing with another invasion. Harald Hardrada of Norway had struck first, landing near York with his own army seeking England's throne. Harold had marched north to meet this threat, leaving the south defended by local forces, inadequate to oppose 7,000 Norman warriors. William waded ashore with his men. Legend says he stumbled as he landed, catching himself on hands and knees. His warriors gasped, seeing this as evil omen, invasion blessed by God beginning with their duke falling on his face. William, brilliant in the moment's crisis, grabbed handfuls of English soil and held them high. "See," he shouted, "I have taken England with both hands." The men cheered. The omen was transformed from disaster to prophecy. They secured the beach quickly, establishing a fortified camp, unloading supplies and horses. No English force appeared to contest them. William sent scouts inland to assess the situation, to locate Harold's army, to determine if immediate battle was necessary or if time existed to prepare. The scouts returned with extraordinary news. Harold was 300 miles north, engaged in battle with Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. The southern coast was undefended. The Normans had landed unopposed, blessed by fortune beyond reasonable expectation. William ordered the construction of a Motte and Bailey castle at Pevensey, a fortification that could be razed in days, using prefabricated timber brought from Normandy. His men, skilled in siege warfare, erected walls and ditches with practiced efficiency. Within 48 hours of landing, the Norman invaders had secure base, supply lines to Normandy, and time to rest before Harold could respond. But William knew his advantage was temporary. Harold would come, and come quickly. The English king would be furious, desperate, having just fought one battle and forced to immediately march south for another. But Harold had something William lacked: knowledge of the terrain, supply lines already established, and an army defending its homeland. William waited, this time with patience born of confidence. The wind had turned. God had smiled. Now came the reckoning. 2 kings, 1 throne. On January 6th, 1066 AD, 2 men believed they would be England's next king. Harold Godwinson stood in Westminster Abbey as Archbishop Ealdred placed the crown upon his head. The ceremony was rushed, completed the day after Edward the Confessor's funeral, before the body had grown cold in its tomb. The speed spoke of desperation. England needed a king immediately, not in weeks or months when proper arrangements could be made. The Danish threat from across the North Sea, the Norwegian threat from across the Norwegian Sea, the Norman threat from across the Channel, all these dangers required immediate response. A kingdom without a king invited invasion like a wound invites infection. 300 miles away in Normandy, William received news of Edward's death and Harold's coronation. With fury so cold his courtiers feared to speak. He had been promised England, or so he claimed. Harold had sworn oaths on holy relics to support his claim, or so William insisted. Now both Edward and Harold had betrayed him. The crown that should have been his rested on the head of an oathbreaker. Harold's position was stronger than William knew, but more precarious than Harold hoped. He commanded England's resources, its wealth, its manpower. He knew the terrain, controlled the fortifications, could call upon the feared militia to supplement his professional troops. But he also knew that 3 separate invasions threatened. Harald Hardrada in Norway was gathering ships, claiming England through convoluted descent from earlier Danish kings. Tostig, Harold's own exiled brother, had allied with Harald Hardrada, bringing intimate knowledge of English defences, and William in Normandy was building the largest invasion fleet seen in centuries. Through the spring and summer, Harold mobilised England. He stationed troops along the southern coast, watching for Norman sails. He kept the feared under arms, peasants torn from their fields to stand guard on beaches. He moved constantly between threatened points, projecting strength, maintaining morale, trying to defend everywhere at once. The strain showed. By early September, with harvest time approaching and no invasion yet materialised, Harold made the painful decision to dismiss the feared. The peasants returned to their farms. The southern coast defence fell to professional troops alone, fewer in number, spread thin across too many miles. Harold kept his personal guard, the housecarls, under arms, elite warriors who formed England's military spine. But even the best warriors cannot be everywhere. On September 18th, 1066, Harald Hardrada's fleet appeared in the north, 300 ships carrying perhaps 10,000 Norwegian and Flemish warriors. They sailed up the Humber, landing near York. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, gathered what forces they could and met the invaders at Fulford on September 20th. The Battle of Fulford was brutal and decisive. The English earls fought well, but Harald Hardrada was perhaps the most experienced warrior in Europe, a man who had spent decades as a mercenary in Constantinople, who had fought battles from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. His forces crushed the English resistance. Edwin and Morcar fled. York, the great northern city, negotiated surrender rather than face sack. Harold, in London when news arrived, had perhaps 4 days to respond. 4 days to gather his forces, march 200 miles north, and engage an enemy that had just destroyed England's northern defences. Lesser men would have waited, consolidated, let Harald Hardrada settle into occupation before responding. Harold rode north immediately, with every man he could gather. The Northern Anvil, the forced march north, was an epic of endurance that should be remembered alongside any feat of arms. Harold's army covered 200 miles in less than 5 days. They marched through rain and mud, sleeping in fields when they slept at all. Driven by a king who knew that speed was his only advantage, Harald Hardrada expected weeks before Harold could respond. The Norwegians were resting, celebrating victory, negotiating with York for supplies. They thought they had time. Harold gave them none. He reached Tadcaster, just south of York, on September 24th. His army was exhausted, strung out along miles of road, but they were there, 4 days ahead of any reasonable expectation. Harold rested his men for 1 night, letting stragglers catch up, ensuring his force was as concentrated as possible. Then, on September 25th, he struck. Harald Hardrada's army was camped at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York. Split between both sides of the River Derwent, they had left their armour at their ships, expecting negotiations, not battle. When Harold's army appeared, the Norwegians scrambled to form defensive lines, fighting in leather and cloth rather than mail, desperately trying to buy time for their comrades across the river to join the battle. The bridge itself became legend. A single Norwegian warrior, armed with a battle axe, held the narrow crossing against the entire English army. He killed 40 men, the sources claim, standing alone, refusing to yield. The English finally killed him by floating a soldier under the bridge in a barrel, who thrust a spear up through the planks. Only then could Harold's forces cross in strength. The battle that followed was slaughter. Harold Hardrada fell, struck by an arrow in the throat. Tostig, Harold's brother turned traitor, died fighting. The Norwegian army, caught unprepared, without armour, exhausted from the forced defence, broke and fled. The English pursued for miles, cutting down warriors too tired to run farther. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norwegians to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold had won a complete, decisive victory. He had saved northern England, killed one claimant to his throne, and demonstrated the kind of military skill that made him England's greatest warrior. His army celebrated, claiming weapons and armour from the dead, taking prisoners for ransom, revelling in the kind of triumph that becomes songs. The celebration lasted 3 days. On the 28th of September, as Harold's exhausted army rested in York, a messenger arrived from the south. Norman ships had been sighted off Pevensey. William had landed. 7,000 fresh Norman warriors were establishing fortifications on England's southern coast, while Harold's army was 200 miles north, exhausted from forced march and brutal battle. Harold faced an impossible situation. His men needed rest, needed time to heal wounds and recover strength, but every day he delayed gave William time to fortify his position, to gather strength, to ravage the southern coast. Harold made the only decision his nature allowed. He would march south immediately, gather what additional forces he could along the way, and crush William before the Normans could consolidate their invasion. It was the right decision strategically, but perhaps the wrong decision tactically. His housecarls, the professional warriors who formed his army's core, were exhausted. The Fyrd that joined him during the march south was hastily assembled, inadequately equipped, poorly trained. Against Vikings, like Harold Hardrada, courage and desperation might suffice. Against Norman heavy cavalry, the finest military force in Western Europe, exhausted troops would face a technological and tactical disadvantage that courage alone couldn't overcome. But Harold had no choice. He was king. England was invaded. He would fight. Senlac Ridge. The armies met on October 14th, 1066 AD, on a ridge near Hastings that the English called Senlac. Harold arrived on the 13th, having covered the 200 miles from York in roughly 7 days. His army was smaller than he had hoped, perhaps 7,000 men, many exhausted from the northern campaign, but he chose his ground brilliantly. The ridge rose perhaps 100 feet above the surrounding terrain, steep enough to break cavalry charges, narrow enough that William couldn't easily flank him. Harold's men formed a shield wall along the ridge crest, the traditional English formation, overlapping shields, creating a barrier that infantry could hold against superior numbers. William's army, perhaps equal in size or slightly larger, assembled in the valley below. They could see the English position, could recognise its strength. Charging uphill against a prepared shield wall would cost lives without guarantee of success. But William had no alternative. He couldn't retreat to Normandy, having achieved nothing. He couldn't wait for Harold to be reinforced. He had to attack, immediately, despite the tactical disadvantage. The battle began at 9 in the morning, with Norman archers advancing to soften the English line. They fired uphill, their arrows arcing into the shield wall. Some found gaps, killing or wounding English warriors. But most struck shields or flew overhead, their effectiveness limited by angle and distance. The English held position, shields locked, waiting. Next came the Norman infantry, men on foot with swords and spears, advancing uphill to engage the shield wall directly. The fighting was intimate and terrible. Warriors stabbed over and under shields, seeking gaps in defence. Men died slowly, bleeding from wounds that wouldn't kill immediately, but would prove fatal within hours. The English held, their shield wall, anchored by housecarls with two-handed axes, repulsed the Norman attack. The infantry retreated, bloodied, having gained nothing. Then William unleashed his cavalry, the weapon that made Norman armies unstoppable across Europe. Hundreds of mounted knights in full armour charged uphill, lances levelled, seeking to shatter the English line through sheer impact. The sound must have been extraordinary. Thunder mixed with the shriek of metal on metal, the screams of horses and men. The cavalry charge broke against the shield wall like a wave against rock. Horses cannot charge into a wall of spears and shields. They balk, turn aside, leaving their riders vulnerable. The English axes fell, cutting through mail and bone, killing horses and riders alike. The Norman cavalry retreated in confusion, having suffered terrible losses for minimal gain. It was at this moment, with the Norman cavalry in retreat, that portions of the English line broke discipline. Seeing their enemy flee, groups of English warriors pursued downhill, seeking to finish wounded knights, to claim armour and weapons. Harold screamed at them to hold position, but the blood was up, the pursuit instinct overwhelming training and discipline. William saw the opportunity. He rallied his retreating cavalry, turned them, and struck the pursuing English from the flanks. Caught in open ground, without their shield wall, the English pursuers died quickly. The Normans rode them down, cut them apart, and retreated before Harold could send reinforcements. Whether this was a planned Norman tactic, a feigned retreat deliberately designed to draw the English from their position, or simply fortunate improvisation, remains debated. The Bayeux tapestry shows William lifting his helmet to prove he still lived after rumours of his death caused panic, suggesting the chaos was genuine rather than planned. But William learned from it. He ordered repeated feigned retreats throughout the afternoon, each one luring portions of the English line from the ridge, each one resulting in Norman cavalry massacring isolated groups. The battle became attrition. The English line held, but grew weaker with each attack. Each feigned retreat, each group of warriors lost to pursuit. The Normans suffered terrible casualties, but had reserves to rotate fresh troops into the fight. William's archers changed tactics, firing high so arrows fell almost vertically onto the English position, finding targets despite the shields. Harold fought in the front rank throughout the day, his dragon banner visible, his presence necessary to maintain morale. The sources disagree on exactly when and how he died. The Bayeux tapestry shows an English warrior pulling an arrow from his eye, then shows another warrior being cut down by Norman cavalry. Were these two separate men, or the same man in two moments? Did Harold die from an arrow wound, or from cavalry strike? The details blur in the chaos of battle, but the result is clear. By late afternoon, Harold was dead. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine dead beside him, and his army knew it. The English line collapsed. Some housecarls fought to the end around Harold's body, refusing to flee, dying where they stood. Others retreated into the gathering darkness, hoping to regroup, to continue resistance. William ordered pursuit, but the terrain was difficult, the light failing, the risk of ambush high. The Norman army camped on the battlefield that night, exhausted, victorious, surrounded by thousands of dead from both sides. William had won England with a single battle, though he didn't know it yet. No English army of comparable size remained. No leader of Harold's stature survived to rally resistance. The kingdom lay open to conquest, waiting for William to claim it. His name was Ethelric, and he was 23 years old when the Normans came to Yorkshire. He was a Thegan, a minor nobleman, holding land near York that his family had farmed for generations. When Harold's army marched north to fight Harold Hardrada, Ethelric rode with them. He fought at Stamford Bridge, survived the battle, though he took a spear wound in his shoulder. He was recovering in York when news came of Hastings, of Harold's death, of Norman victory. The Northern Earls, what remained of them after Fulford, submitted to William within months. Better to bend than break, they reasoned. Better to keep their lands under Norman rule than lose everything in futile resistance. Ethelric refused. He returned to his manor, gathered his household, and prepared to resist. The resistance was small, scattered, desperate. In 1069, York rose in rebellion. They massacred the Norman garrison William had installed, burned the castle he had built, and declared for Edgar the Atheling, the last Anglo-Saxon claimant to the throne. Other Thegners like Ethelric joined them, forming bands of warriors who struck at Norman forces and melted back into the northern hills. William's response was methodical and terrible. He marched north with his army in the winter of 1069 to 1070, despite snow and freezing temperatures that should have made campaigning impossible. What followed became known as the Harrying of the North, a systematic campaign of destruction that sought to break northern resistance by destroying the very means of survival. Norman forces spread across Yorkshire in coordinated sweeps. They burned villages, every structure put to the torch. They slaughtered livestock, cattle, and sheep and pigs, leaving carcasses to rot in fields. They destroyed grain stores, the seed corn that would allow spring planting. They killed anyone who resisted and many who didn't. The goal wasn't military victory, but creation of a wasteland where resistance couldn't survive because nothing could survive. Ethelric watched his manor burn. The Normans came in the depths of winter, 50 mounted knights against his household of 12 warriors. He could have fought, died, defending his hall like the heroes in old songs. Instead, he thought of his wife, his 2 children, his people who depended on him. He fled into the hills with everyone who could walk, abandoning everything his family had built. They survived the winter by moving constantly, never staying long enough for the Normans to find them, eating what they could forage or steal, watching from hiding as columns of smoke marked the destruction of village after village. The cold killed as effectively as Norman swords. Ethelric's daughter died of fever in February, 5 years old, buried in frozen ground without ceremony. His wife stopped speaking, her eyes empty, her spirit broken by watching their world end. By spring, the resistance was finished. Those who hadn't died of violence or cold or starvation submitted or fled to Scotland. The land lay devastated, corpses everywhere, fields unplanted, villages empty shells. Chroniclers record that the harrying killed perhaps 100,000 people, though numbers from this period are unreliable. What's certain is that Yorkshire's population dropped catastrophically. Decades later, the Domesday Book records entire regions still depopulated, still unable to support normal agricultural activity. Ethelric surrendered in March, bringing his remaining people to York to submit to Norman authority. William was merciful by the standards of the time. He allowed Ethelric to keep a portion of his land, enough to support a modest household, in exchange for oaths of loyalty. Ethelric swore the oaths, knowing he had no choice, hating every word. He lived another 30 years, long enough to see his son grow up speaking French better than English, long enough to watch Norman castles rise across Yorkshire, long enough to become a relic of a world that no longer existed. He never rebelled again. The harrying had taught him what resistance cost. Better to survive as a subordinate than die as a hero. Better to preserve something than lose everything. But on winter nights, when the wind howled across the Yorkshire hills, Ethelric remembered his manor burning, remembered his daughter's grave, remembered the world the Normans had destroyed, and he taught his grandson the old stories, the old language, the old ways, passing them on like precious seeds, hidden from conquerors who would stamp them out if they knew. Castle and crown. Within 5 years of Hastings, England bristled with Norman castles like a hedgehog with quills. These weren't the massive stone fortresses that would come later, the Tower of London, and Dover Castle and Windsor. Those required years to build, skilled masons, enormous expense. William needed fortifications immediately, structures that could be raised in days using local materials and unskilled labour. He turned to the motte and bailey design, a Norman innovation that revolutionised military occupation. Picture the construction. Norman forces would arrive at a strategic location, a river crossing or road junction or existing English town. They would seize a central area and put the population to work. Labourers dug a circular ditch, piling the excavated earth into a mound called a motte. Atop this artificial hill, perhaps 30 feet high, workers erected a wooden tower, the keep, using prefabricated timber when available or local wood when necessary. Around the base of the motte, more ditches and earthworks created an outer enclosure, the bailey, where soldiers camped and horses were stabled. The entire structure could be completed in 2 weeks if pressed hard. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. The keep dominated the surrounding area, providing a watchtower and final defensive position. The bailey housed a garrison large enough to control the region, and the psychological impact was immense. These castles appeared overnight, stamping Norman authority onto the English landscape, visible reminders that conquest wasn't temporary raid, but permanent occupation. William built them everywhere: Canterbury, Winchester, Nottingham, York, Durham. Every significant town received its castle. In London, he built the White Tower, eventually expanding it into the Tower of London, a stone fortress designed to awe and intimidate the capital's population. The message was clear and impossible to ignore: Norman rule wasn't negotiable. Resistance meant facing professional soldiers in fortified positions, supplied from Normandy if necessary, unassailable by any force the English could muster. The castles also served economic and administrative functions. They became collection points for taxes, centres of Norman law, places where English plaintiffs brought disputes for Norman lords to settle. The castle's presence transformed the surrounding area, creating markets that fed the garrison, attracting craftsmen who served Norman needs, gradually making each location more Norman and less English. For the English population, the castles were wounds in their landscape, foreign growths that disrupted traditional patterns of life. Villages were demolished to clear fields of fire. Forests were cleared to deny cover to potential rebels. Ancient paths were diverted around castle precincts. The land itself was being reordered to serve Norman strategic needs, rather than English agricultural tradition. But the castles worked. Within a generation, England had perhaps 500 Norman fortifications, most small mortar and bailey structures, but some evolving into stone strongholds. This network of castles, connected by roads patrolled by Norman cavalry, made coordinated English resistance impossible. A rebel band might strike and retreat, but they couldn't hold territory against forces that could muster in defended positions and respond with cavalry speed. The architectural subjugation was complete. England would never successfully rebel against Norman rule, not because the English lacked courage, but because the Normans had changed the strategic landscape so thoroughly that rebellion became tactically impossible. The Domesday Reckoning. In 1085, 20 years after Hastings, William ordered a survey of England that was unprecedented in medieval Europe. He wanted to know everything his new kingdom contained. Every hide of land, every plough, every ox and pig and sheep. He wanted to know who held what property, what taxes they owed, what the land had been worth before his conquest, and what it was worth now. The survey would be so thorough, so inescapable, that men said not even an ox or cow or pig escaped its recording. They called it the Domesday Book, comparing it to the Last Judgment, when all things would be known and none could hide. The surveyors went everywhere, riding from manor to manor with their questions and their scribes. They interrogated local officials, compared testimony from multiple sources to prevent fraud, recorded everything in Latin with bureaucratic precision that would have impressed Rome at its height. The English had never experienced anything like it. Previous kings knew roughly what they ruled, knew their major landholders, collected taxes based on custom and approximation. William wanted exactitude. The Domesday Book reveals the extent of Norman transformation. Of the roughly 13,000 places recorded, the vast majority now had Norman lords. English Degners, who had ruled for generations, were gone, replaced by Norman knights who spoke French, followed Norman law, built Norman castles. The English didn't disappear, of course. They remained the overwhelming majority of the population, farming the land as they always had. But they farmed it now for foreign masters, paid taxes to foreign lords, answered to foreign law. The survey also reveals the devastation of William's conquest. Regions that had resisted showed dramatic decreases in value. Yorkshire, site of the harrying, was recorded as wasteland in many places, entire hundreds depopulated, productive land lying fallow decades after the violence. The Domesday Book is both triumph and confession, proof of administrative sophistication, alongside evidence of conquest's terrible cost. For William, the survey served multiple purposes. It identified tax revenue, allowing him to know exactly what England could provide. It settled disputes about land ownership, establishing legal clarity where confusion had allowed evasion. It asserted royal authority at the most local level, making clear that William's government could and would know everything about everyone. For the English, the Domesday Survey was final proof that the old world was gone. 20 years after Hastings, there would be no restoration of Anglo-Saxon rule, no return to the kingdom Harold had briefly held. The Normans weren't temporary occupiers, but permanent masters. Their systematic control, their castles and courts, and now their comprehensive survey, demonstrated that resistance was futile and the transformation irreversible. England was Norman now, by right of conquest and by administrative reality. The survey was William's final stamp on his achievement, the bureaucratic equivalent of Hastings, a bloodless victory that secured what violence had won, the language of conquest. You are walking through London in 1105 AD, 40 years after the conquest, and everywhere you hear two languages fighting for space. In the market, merchants haggle in English, the guttural Germanic tongue that has been spoken in Britain for 6 centuries. But when a Norman official passes, collecting taxes or settling disputes, everyone switches to French. The officials don't speak English, or claim not to. If you want justice, if you need favour, if you hope to advance, you must speak the language of power. You are English by birth, the grandson of a Degan who died at Hastings, but your father learned French to keep his diminished lands. He insisted you learn it too, hiring a tutor who beat correct pronunciation into you with a wooden rod. Now you speak both languages, English at home with your mother, French at court when dealing with Norman lords. Your mind lives in 2 worlds simultaneously, translating constantly, never entirely comfortable in either. At Westminster, where King Henry holds court, Henry being William's son and successor, the language is entirely French. The nobles converse in the langue d'oil, the northern French dialect the Normans brought from Rouen. Legal proceedings are in French or Latin, never English. Poetry is French. Chronicles are Latin or French. English is the language of peasants and conquered peoples, suitable for giving orders to servants, but not for discussing literature or law or anything that matters. You notice how language marks class. The animals in the field have English names: cow, sheep, pig, names as old as the Anglo-Saxon settlement. But the meat on a noble's table has French names. Beef from boeuf, mutton from mouton, pork from pork. The workers who tend the animals speak English. The nobles who eat them speak French. Language divides society as clearly as castle walls divide the landscape. The church presents its own complications. Services are in Latin, comprehensible to educated men of both peoples. But the priests are increasingly Norman, appointed by Norman bishops, trained in Norman traditions. They preach in French, assuming their noble congregations understand. For the English peasants who attend these churches, the words become meaningless sounds, ritual without comprehension. Religion itself becomes foreign. Yet you notice something else, something subtle that grows more obvious as years pass. The Norman children, born in England, are learning English from their nurses and servants. They speak French with their fathers, but English with their playmates. English words are seeping into French conversation, terms for things that exist only in England, or for which French lacks convenient vocabulary. The languages are beginning to merge, to influence each other, to create something that is neither pure English nor pure French, but a hybrid. The Norman lords mock English as crude and unsophisticated, but their grandchildren will speak it by necessity, because ruling England requires communication with the English. In 200 years, the language of the court will be English again, though an English transformed by French vocabulary, French syntax, French concepts. The language of law, of government, of culture will carry permanent French influence, 30% of its vocabulary borrowed from the conquerors. But standing in 1105, you cannot see this future. You see only division, humiliation, the daily reminder that conquest didn't end at Hastings, but continues in every conversation, every legal proceeding, every church service. Language is power, and power speaks French. Your grandchildren will forget how to speak English properly. Your great-grandchildren might not speak it at all. The conquest is swallowing your culture, word by word, generation by generation, leaving nothing but memories and a few old poems that fewer people can read with each passing year. Subact IIB, the Sicilian Gambit, the Hauteville Hunger, in the early 1100s AD, in a modest manner in northwestern Normandy, a minor noble named Tancred of Hauteville had a problem. He had 12 sons, 12 ambitious, violent, gifted sons, and land sufficient to support perhaps 3 in the style they expected. Norman inheritance law dictated that the eldest would inherit the estate. The others needed to find their fortunes elsewhere, through marriage or service or conquest. Tancred's sons chose conquest. The oldest, William, called Iron Arm for his strength in battle, heard stories from pilgrims returning from Jerusalem. They spoke of southern Italy, a region torn by conflict between the Byzantine Empire ruling from Constantinople, the Holy Roman Empire pressing from the north, and various Arab emirates controlling Sicily and portions of the mainland. This chaos represented opportunity. Warriors were needed. Land was available for men, brave and ruthless enough to take it. William departed for Italy around 1035 AD, taking several brothers with him. They joined a band of Norman mercenaries already operating in the region, selling their services to whichever lord paid best. These early Norman adventurers were bandits as much as soldiers, taking payment in plunder when cash wasn't available, carving small holdings from contested territory, living by the sword with the expectation of dying by it. What made the Hauteville brothers different was their ambition. Other Norman mercenaries were content to serve, to fight for pay, to perhaps gain a small estate if fortune smiled. The Hautevilles wanted kingdoms. They possessed the combination of military skill, political cunning, and sheer ruthlessness necessary to transform mercenary service into conquest. The youngest of Tancred's sons to reach Italy, Robert, arrived around 1046 AD. He was perhaps 15 years old, with nothing but a horse and 5 companions, seeking his fortune in a land where opportunity and death existed in equal measure. His brothers had already established themselves, holding small territories, building reputations. Robert would surpass them all. Men called him Guiscard, the cunning, the wily, the clever, not because he was educated or sophisticated, but because he could see opportunities others missed, could turn defeat into advantage, could lie convincingly when necessary, and strike without warning when deception failed. He was tall and strong, a formidable warrior in personal combat, but his real weapon was his mind. He understood that in southern Italy's chaos, the greatest threat wasn't death but irrelevance, better to be feared and hated than ignored. He began by raiding, small attacks against wealthy monasteries or isolated Byzantine officials, operations that required more audacity than forces. He recruited men with promises of plunder, building a war band from dispossessed younger sons like himself. Men with nothing to lose and everything to gain. His raids grew bolder. He captured a Byzantine governor, ransomed him for enormous sum, used the silver to recruit more warriors, and purchase better equipment. His older brothers watched with mixture of admiration and concern. Robert was succeeding too well, growing too powerful, threatening to overshadow them. In 1057, when William Ironarm died, the Norman holdings in southern Italy needed a leader. Robert maneuvered and intimidated his way into leadership, becoming Count of Apulia, the dominant Norman power in the region. He was perhaps 30 years old, ruling territory he had entered as a landless adventurer 11 years earlier. But Robert looked south to Sicily and saw something that consumed his ambition. The island was wealthy, controlling Mediterranean trade routes, producing grain and silk and citrus fruits. It was held by Arab emirs, fragmented into competing realms, rich and seemingly vulnerable. Robert wanted Sicily. His younger brother Roger, arriving in Italy around 1058, would help him take it. The Guiscard's rise. The story of how Robert Guiscard seized control of Norman forces in southern Italy reveals his character perfectly. In 1056, his brother Humphrey held nominal leadership of the Normans in Apulia, but Humphrey was weak, indecisive, unable to control the fractious Norman warbands that operated semi-independently, serving their own interests rather than coordinating under unified command. The situation frustrated Robert, who recognized that disunity prevented the Normans from achieving their potential. When Humphrey died in 1057, leaving young sons as heirs, Robert moved immediately. He didn't claim leadership through inheritance or election. He simply began acting as though he was already in charge, issuing commands, organizing campaigns, distributing captured territory. Other Norman leaders could accept his authority or fight him for it. Most chose acceptance. Those who chose resistance found themselves facing Robert's warriors at disadvantageous moments. Their lands seized, their followers recruited away with promises of richer plunder under Robert's leadership. Pope Leo IX, watching the Normans grow stronger, decided to crush them before they became uncontrollable. In 1053, before Robert's rise to dominance, the Pope had led an army south to drive the Norman mercenaries from Italy. Robert fought in that campaign, watching as Norman cavalry destroyed the papal forces at Civitate. The Normans, outnumbered, used terrain and tactics to shatter an army that should have overwhelmed them. They captured the Pope himself, treated him with exaggerated respect, while making clear he was powerless to stop them. Robert learned from this victory, military force alone couldn't secure lasting success. The Normans needed legitimacy, needed the Church's blessing rather than its enmity. So when Robert became leader, he negotiated with Pope Nicholas II, who succeeded Leo. The terms were straightforward. Robert would hold his Italian territories as papal vassal, defending church interests and paying tribute. In exchange, the Pope recognized Robert's conquests as legitimate, blessed his future campaigns, and made him Duke of Apulia and Calabria. This was the Hauteville genius. They understood that conquest required more than martial skill. It required legal justification, religious sanction, diplomatic maneuvering. Robert transformed Norman presence in Italy from banditry to statehood through a combination of violence and politics, never relying entirely on either. His next move demonstrated this synthesis. He married Sicilgaita, a Lombard princess whose family ruled Salerno. She brought legitimacy, connections to Italian nobility, and her own formidable personality. Sources describe her riding in armor, alongside Robert, fighting in battles, advising on strategy. Their marriage was partnership, not ornament, each using the other to achieve shared ambitions. With internal Norman politics consolidated, with papal blessing secured, with Italian allies bound through marriage, Robert turned his full attention to Sicily. The conquest would take 30 years, conducted primarily by his younger brother Roger, while Robert fought Byzantines on the mainland. But the vision was Robert's, the strategy was Robert's, and the transformation of poor Norman knights into Mediterranean powers began with the cunning Robert brought to southern Italy's chaos. Between three empires, southern Italy, in the mid-1100s, was a region of extraordinary complexity, a frontier zone where three great powers struggled for dominance. The Byzantine Empire, ruling from Constantinople, considered Italy rightfully theirs, heir to Rome's western territories. They held substantial portions of the south and Sicily, governed by Catapans and Strategos who maintained Greek language, Orthodox Christianity, and Byzantine law. But Constantinople was distracted by threats from the east, by Seljuk Turks pressing into Anatolia, by internal court politics. Byzantine Italy was the empire's neglected periphery, defended inadequately, governed inconsistently. The Holy Roman Empire, controlling Germany and northern Italy, also claimed authority over the south. German emperors viewed themselves as heirs to Charlemagne, rulers of a renewed Western Rome. But their power weakened south of Rome, where distance and Italian resistance limited their control. They influenced papal politics, occasionally sent armies south, but couldn't establish lasting dominion. The Islamic world controlled Sicily and portions of the southern mainland. Arab conquest in the 800s had established emirates that grew wealthy from Mediterranean trade. By the 1100s, these emirates were fragmented, competing with each other, but still militarily formidable and economically sophisticated. They had transformed Sicily into a prosperous, cultured realm where Greek, Arabic, and Latin cultures mingled, creating something unique in the medieval Mediterranean. Into this three-way struggle came the Normans, a fourth power, initially so insignificant that none of the great empires took them seriously. They arrived as mercenaries, landless knights seeking employment, willing to fight for anyone who paid. But they possessed advantages the empires lacked: They were unified by common culture and military tradition, despite lacking central authority. They were motivated by hunger for land rather than abstract imperial claims, and they had learned from all three empires they fought against, adopting Byzantine administrative techniques, Holy Roman feudal structures, and Arab military innovations. The Normans also benefited from their position as Latin Christians. The Pope, locked in struggle with both Orthodox Byzantium and Muslim emirates, saw the Normans as potential allies, despite their violence and ambition. Papal recognition transformed Norman conquest from piracy to crusade, from theft to liberation. When Robert Guiscard and Roger attacked Byzantine or Arab territories, they carried papal blessing, making their wars holy rather than predatory. This legitimacy was crucial. Without it, the Normans would have faced unified opposition from all three empires. Instead, they played powers against each other. When fighting Byzantines, they had papal support. When fighting Muslims in Sicily, they had both papal and Byzantine passive acceptance, since Constantinople preferred Norman control to Arab control if they couldn't hold the island themselves. When threatening papal territory, they could hint at alliance with either Byzantium or the Arabs, keeping Rome negotiating rather than opposing. The geographic position reinforced this advantage. Southern Italy was far enough from Constantinople, Rome, and the Arab centres of power that none could project sustained military force. Armies would arrive, campaign for a season, then withdraw as logistics or other threats demanded attention. The Normans, establishing permanent holdings, defending from fortified positions, could outlast imperial expeditions by simply surviving until the invaders left. What emerged was a Norman strategy of patient conquest, taking territory piece by piece, fortifying each gain before advancing, building strength through accumulation rather than decisive campaigns. They would fight for 30 years to take Sicily. They would spend decades consolidating control of the southern mainland, but once taken, Norman territory stayed taken, unlike the shifting conquests of the empires they fought. By 1100 AD, the pattern was clear. The three great empires were declining powers in southern Italy, unable to maintain or expand their holdings. The Normans were rising, transforming from mercenary bands into a coherent state that would eventually surpass in sophistication any of the powers that had initially employed them. The Siege of Palermo. In the summer of 1072, Roger Guiscard stood outside the walls of Palermo and contemplated the city that would make or break his conquest of Sicily. The siege had already lasted 5 months. Palermo was the Arab Emirates' capital, the richest city in Sicily, defended by walls built by Romans and strengthened by Arabs over centuries. The city held perhaps 50,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the medieval Mediterranean. It had withstood numerous attacks over 200 years of Arab rule. Taking it through assault seemed impossible. Starving it into submission would require years that Roger couldn't afford. Roger had been fighting in Sicily for 14 years by this point, since 1058, when his brother Robert had invaded with his support. They had taken Messina in 1061, establishing a Norman bridgehead. Since then, Roger had conducted a methodical campaign across the island, taking fortresses and towns, fighting Arab forces in countless small engagements, slowly tightening his grip on Sicily. But Palermo remained the key. If he could take Palermo, the remaining Arab resistance would collapse. If he failed, the conquest might stall indefinitely. The military situation presented multiple challenges. Palermo's harbour allowed resupply by sea, making traditional siege tactics ineffective. The walls were formidable, requiring siege engines that Roger's forces struggled to build and operate. The Arab garrison was experienced, well-equipped, motivated by religious devotion as strong as Roger's own crusading fervour, and Sicily's summer heat made campaigning brutal, disease killing more men than combat. Roger's solution was characteristically practical. He couldn't take Palermo by assault or starvation alone, so he combined both approaches while adding a third element, negotiation. He blockaded the harbour, with ships seized from coastal towns, cutting maritime supply. He built siege works around the land walls, not attempting immediate assault, but establishing permanent encirclement. And he sent messages to Palermo's emir, offering terms: submit peacefully and keep your property and life, resist and face sack. The emir refused. Roger continued the siege through summer into autumn, his forces suffering from heat and disease, but maintaining their grip. Inside Palermo, food supplies dwindled. The population began to fear what would happen if the walls were breached. Medieval sieges ended in slaughter and rape when cities fell by assault. Surrender offered hope of mercy. In January 1073, after 7 months of siege, Palermo negotiated. The emir agreed to leave the city, taking his household and treasury. The Arab garrison would be allowed to retreat to remaining Muslim holdings in western Sicily. The city's population would remain unmolested. Roger would take Palermo intact, without the destruction that assault would cause. Roger accepted these terms immediately. He wanted Palermo functional, not ruined. He needed its harbour operational, its markets active, its workshops producing. A city put to the sword would take decades to recover. A city taken by negotiation could serve Norman interests immediately. The moment when Norman forces entered Palermo marked the true turning point in Sicily's conquest. The city was unprecedented in Roger's experience, more sophisticated than anything in Normandy or southern Italy. The architecture blended Roman foundations with Arab additions, creating structures more beautiful than functional. The market sold goods from across the Mediterranean: North African spices, Byzantine silk, Arab metalwork. The population was mixed: Arabs, Greeks, Jews, Berbers, Latin Christians, all living in separate quarters but interacting economically. Roger made a decision that would define Norman Sicily's character. He didn't expel the Muslims or force conversion. He didn't replace Arab administrators with Normans who knew nothing of governing complex urban society. Instead, he kept existing structures largely intact, placing Norman military force at the top, but allowing Arab officials to continue managing civil administration, allowing Muslim judges to apply Islamic law to Muslim populations, allowing Greek Christians to maintain their separate church hierarchy. This wasn't tolerance in the modern sense, but pragmatism. Roger had perhaps 2,000 Norman warriors to control an island of several 100,000 people, mostly Muslim or Greek Orthodox. Forcing cultural uniformity would require violence on a scale that would destroy the prosperity he hoped to exploit. Maintaining diversity, however uncomfortable for Latin Christian ideology, allowed Sicily to function. Palermo became Roger's capital, the centre of a realm unlike anywhere else in Christian Europe. In the following decades, Norman Sicily would develop a unique character, a kingdom where 3 languages were official, where Arab craftsmen worked on Christian churches, where Muslim poets received patronage from Christian kings, where administrative efficiency, borrowed from Byzantine tradition and military force, followed Norman models. It was conquest, yes, but conquest that preserved what it seized, transforming rather than destroying. A kingdom of 3 faiths. Walk through Palermo in 1120 AD, 50 years after Roger's conquest, and you encounter a city that should not exist by medieval European standards. In the morning, church bells ring from Norman chapels, while the call to prayer echoes from mosques that Roger's successors allowed to remain open. Greek Orthodox priests in their black robes pass Arab merchants in white turbans. Jewish scholars debate in Hebrew, while Norman knights practice in French. The city speaks 3 languages depending on context: Latin for official documents, Greek for commerce, Arabic for poetry and philosophy. The royal court reflects this multiplicity. King Roger II, grandson of the Conqueror, employs Arab administrators who keep records in Arabic script. His legal code incorporates Byzantine Roman law, Islamic jurisprudence, and Norman feudal custom, creating a hybrid system that seems designed by committee but functions with surprising effectiveness. The palace guards include Normans, Arabs, and Greeks, each group maintaining separate traditions but all swearing loyalty to Roger. The architecture tells the story most visibly. The Palatine Chapel, Roger II's royal church, combines Norman Romanesque structure with Byzantine mosaics and Arab geometric designs. Latin inscriptions appear alongside Greek and Arabic texts. The interior glows with gold leaf, applied by Byzantine craftsmen, while the ceiling displays Arab muqarnas work, the honeycomb vaulting that Islamic architecture perfected. No other building in Christian Europe looks like this. No other building could, because nowhere else did three civilizations merge under single authority. This wasn't peaceful coexistence based on philosophical tolerance. The Normans ruled through military dominance, maintaining garrisons in key locations, crushing resistance violently when necessary. Muslims and Greeks lived under Christian overlords, paid higher taxes than Christians, faced restrictions on bearing arms, and building new religious structures. The power dynamic was clear and enforced. But compared to other medieval conquests, Norman Sicily was extraordinarily light-handed. The alternative model existed in Spain, where Christian reconquest brought forced conversion, expulsion, or death for Muslim populations. Sicily under the Normans avoided this path, not from moral enlightenment, but from practical calculation. The Muslims were skilled craftsmen, experienced merchants, productive taxpayers. Driving them out would impoverish the realm. Forcing conversion would drive them to rebellion. Allowing them to remain Muslim, while subordinate to Christian rule, enriched everyone. The Greek population, Orthodox Christians who had lived under Byzantine rule, initially viewed the Normans as heretics and barbarians. But Norman rule was less extractive than late Byzantine administration had been. Taxes lower, justice more accessible. The Greeks gradually accepted Norman authority, especially as Roger II employed Greek scholars and administrators, valuing their education and Byzantine governmental experience. The Jews, always vulnerable as minorities in Christian lands, found surprising security in Norman Sicily. Roger II protected them, valued their role as translators and intermediaries between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish worlds. Jewish communities in Palermo and other cities flourished, producing scholars who would influence European thought for centuries. This three-faith coexistence produced remarkable cultural achievements. Arab and Greek texts were translated into Latin, introducing Western Europe to Greek philosophy, Arab mathematics, and Islamic science. The Sicilian translation movement would help spark the Renaissance centuries later. Poetry in multiple languages flourished at Roger's court. Architectural innovations spread from Sicily across Europe, influencing cathedral design from England to the Holy Land. Yet, this golden moment was fragile, dependent on Norman commitment to maintaining it. Later generations of rulers, more interested in European politics than Sicilian particularity, would abandon this model. By the 1300s, Sicily's Muslims would be expelled or forced to convert. The Greeks would be subordinated completely to Latin church authority. The Jewish communities would face persecution. The unique civilization Norman pragmatism created would be destroyed by successors who valued religious uniformity over multicultural prosperity. But in 1120, walking through Palermo's streets, this decline remained invisible. The city hummed with commerce and learning, proof that conquest didn't require cultural destruction, that power could be maintained without obliterating difference, that pragmatism sometimes produced outcomes that idealism couldn't achieve. Anna's account. You are Anna Komnene, daughter of Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, and you are writing about barbarians who threaten your father's empire. The year is 1148, and you are composing the Alexiad, a history of your father's reign. You write in Constantinople, far from the events you describe, but your sources are excellent and your memory sharp. You remember meeting some of these Normans personally when you were young, remember their crude manners and dangerous ambition. Now, decades later, you try to explain to readers how these barbarians from the West became such a threat to civilized Byzantium. Your father became emperor in 1081, seizing the throne from incompetent predecessors who had allowed the empire to decay. He inherited catastrophe. Seljuk Turks controlled most of Anatolia, threatening Constantinople itself. Pecheneg nomads raided across the Balkans, and from Italy came the most immediate threat, Robert Guiscard, with his Norman army. You describe Robert with grudging respect. He was tall, you write, with booming voice and fierce aspect. He was cunning, living up to his nickname. He was utterly without honour, in the civilized sense. breaking oaths whenever advantage demanded, but reliable in his own way because his ambitions were predictable. He wanted land, wanted power, wanted his name remembered. These were motivations your father could understand and counter. Robert's invasion of Byzantine territory in 1081 terrified Constantinople. He besieged Dyrrhachium, the gateway to the empire's European lands, with perhaps 15,000 men, including cavalry, that Byzantium couldn't match. Your father assembled an army, mostly mercenaries because the traditional Byzantine military structure had collapsed. He engaged Robert at Dyrrhachium in October 1081, hoping to relieve the siege. You write carefully about this battle, minimizing Byzantine defeat but unable to conceal it entirely. Your father's forces outnumbered the Normans. They held good defensive position. But Norman cavalry shattered the Byzantine line, pursuing fleeing soldiers for miles, inflicting catastrophic casualties. Dyrrhachium fell. Robert advanced deeper into Byzantine territory, taking cities that had been Roman for over 1,000 years. What saved Byzantium wasn't military victory, but politics. Your father, brilliant at diplomacy, encouraged Robert's enemies in Italy to rebel against Norman rule. He sent gold to the Pope, to German princes, to anyone who would threaten Robert's rear. Robert was forced to return to Italy, leaving his son Bohemond to command in Greece. Your father's armies, reinforced and better led, pushed the Normans back. By 1085, when Robert died of fever while planning another campaign, the Norman threat seemed contained. But you write with worry about Robert's son, Bohemond, who you remember from your youth. He visited Constantinople as a hostage after one treaty, a young man already showing his father's cunning and ambition. He was handsome, you admit, in the crude Norman way, tall and golden-haired, speaking broken Greek with an accent that made court ladies laugh. But his eyes, you write, held calculation and hunger. He would be dangerous. Your prediction proved correct. When the First Crusade began in 1095, Bohemond joined despite your father's concerns. The Crusaders passed through Constantinople, awkward allies, united by religious purpose, but divided by culture and ambition. Your father tried to bind them with oaths, making them swear to return captured Byzantine territory rather than keeping it for themselves. Bohemond swore, but you knew from his father's example that Norman oaths meant nothing when power was at stake. After the Crusaders captured Antioch from the Turks in 1098, Bohemond claimed it as his own principality, refusing to return it to Byzantine control despite his oath. Your father raged but could do little. Antioch had been Byzantine for centuries, a major city, a patriarchal see. Now it was Norman, held by the son of Robert Guiscard, threatening Byzantine interests in the Levant, as his father had threatened them in the Balkans. You write about the Normans with mixed emotions. They were barbarians, uncouth, obsessed with warfare and plunder, but they were also formidable, perhaps the finest cavalry in the world, led by men who combined military skill with strategic thinking. Your father treated them as the primary Western threat, more dangerous than German emperors or Italian cities, because Normans were unpredictable and unstoppable when they focused their power. Your history, written decades after these events, tries to make sense of how these adventurers, descendants of pagan raiders, conquered so much so quickly. You attribute it partly to their military advantages, the cavalry charges that shattered every army they faced, partly to their ruthlessness, their willingness to break any rule that hindered success, but partly, you admit reluctantly, to their competence. They adapted to situations, learned from enemies, combined innovation with tradition in ways that made them dangerous beyond their numbers. As you write, Norman power continues to grow. They control southern Italy completely. They rule Sicily as kings. They hold Antioch in the Levant. They conquered England decades ago. Everywhere they go, they succeed, not through cultural superiority, but through military excellence and political cunning. You wonder, in passages you don't write down but think privately, whether Byzantium's days of greatness are ending, whether these barbarian kingdoms represent the future, while your ancient empire represents a past that cannot survive. But you write for Byzantine readers, so you emphasize your father's victories, minimize defeats, and present the Normans as dangerous, but ultimately containable. Your readers want reassurance, not prophecy. You give them what they need while recording, between the lines, your understanding that the world is changing in ways Byzantium cannot stop. The call from Jerusalem. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd at Clermont in France and called for holy war. The speech he delivered that day, reconstructed from multiple accounts that don't entirely agree, crystallized decades of Byzantine requests for military aid and transformed them into religious crusade. Jerusalem was in Muslim hands, Urban proclaimed. Christian pilgrims were suffering. The holy sites where Christ walked were controlled by infidels. Western Christendom must respond, must take up arms, must liberate the Holy Land. Urban offered extraordinary inducement. Anyone who took crusader vows would receive complete remission of sins, full forgiveness for any transgression, guaranteed salvation if they died in God's service. This wasn't just warfare but pilgrimage under arms, a path to heaven paved with Muslim blood. The spiritual reward was eternal. The temporal reward, though Urban mentioned it less directly, could include land, plunder, and glory for men brave enough to seize them. The response exceeded Urban's expectations. Thousands took crusader vows immediately, sewing red crosses onto their clothing to mark their commitment. Within months, tens of thousands more joined. Entire regions mobilized for war. The movement drew from all levels of society, from landless knights seeking fortune, to wealthy nobles abandoning estates, to great lords bringing hundreds of warriors under their command. Among those who heard the call with particular interest was Bohemond of Taranto, Robert Guiscard's son, now in his 30s and looking for opportunity. Bohemond controlled Taranto in southern Italy, part of his father's conquests, but not the dominant position he craved. His half-brother Roger Borsa held their father's primary Italian territories. Bohemond, always in his father's shadow, now in his brother's shadow, saw the crusade as a chance for independent glory. He took crusader vows with enthusiasm that contemporaries noted was perhaps more ambitious than spiritual. Bohemond wasn't particularly pious, he was practical, seeing in Jerusalem's liberation a justification for conquest that would serve his interests. The crusade would take him east, toward Byzantine lands his father had tried to conquer, toward Muslim territories ripe for seizure. If he succeeded, he might carve out a realm that surpassed anything his father achieved. The Norman contribution to the First Crusade was substantial. Beyond Bohemond, many southern Italian Normans joined, bringing their military expertise to a movement that needed professional warriors to balance the enthusiasm of untrained pilgrims. Norman knights from France, from Sicily, from England, all heard Urban's call and responded. They would form the Crusade's elite military force, the cavalry that would break Muslim armies from Anatolia to Jerusalem. The crusade gathered through 1096, various contingents assembling separately, then converging on Constantinople. Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, who had requested military aid, watched with growing alarm as Western armies far larger than he anticipated approached his capital. He had wanted mercenaries he could control. He received instead an invasion force of his supposed allies. Tens of thousands of warriors, led by ambitious nobles, who might turn their swords against Byzantium as easily as against Muslims. Alexios required oaths from the crusade leaders, making them swear to return captured Byzantine territory rather than keeping it. Most swore reluctantly, recognizing they needed Byzantine support for supplies and guides. Bohemond swore like his father before him, knowing oaths could be broken when circumstances allowed. The crusade marched east in spring 1097, entering Anatolia, beginning the campaign that would take them to Jerusalem and beyond. Bohemond rode with them, commanding his Italian Normans, watching for opportunity, calculating how to turn religious pilgrimage into personal conquest. So, the crusade would succeed beyond anyone's expectations. Bohemond would succeed even more, seizing a principality that his descendants would rule for generations, proving once again that Norman ambition knew no limits save the reach of their swords. The long march east. His name was Tancred, nephew of Bohemond, and at 25 years old he was marching toward Jerusalem with 10,000 other warriors. The Crusades' journey from Constantinople to the Holy Land was an epic of endurance that tested everyone who undertook it. Tancred had grown up in southern Italy, hearing stories of his uncle Bohemund's prowess and his grandfather Robert Guiscard's conquests. He had trained for warfare since childhood, could handle sword and lance with deadly skill, could ride for hours in full armour under Mediterranean sun. But nothing prepared him for the 1,000-mile march through hostile territory, with an army that numbered perhaps 60,000, when peasant pilgrims were included. The crusade crossed Anatolia in the summer of 1097, following Byzantine guides through land the Seljuk Turks controlled. The heat was crushing. Men and horses died from thirst when water supplies failed. The Turks harassed the crusade with hit and run attacks, shooting arrows from horseback, then retreating before the Norman cavalry could charge. The Crusaders learned to maintain tight formation, to never pursue too far, to treat every grove of trees as potential ambush. The first major battle came at Dorylaeum, where a Turkish army tried to destroy the crusade. Tancred fought in the cavalry charge that broke the Turkish line, watching as Norman heavy cavalry, the same tactical innovation that conquered England and Sicily, proved equally effective against Eastern enemies. The Turks fought skillfully, but they couldn't stand against armoured knights in coordinated charge. The Crusaders won decisively, capturing the Turkish camp, taking supplies that sustained them through the next weeks of march. The Crusades split to besiege different cities. Tancred followed Bohemund south toward Antioch, while other contingents pursued different objectives. This was where Norman discipline showed its value. While other Crusader groups struggled with competing leaders and confused command structures, Bohemund's Normans operated with efficient hierarchy, learned in Italy and Sicily. Orders were followed, tactics were coordinated. The unit functioned as a military machine rather than armed mob. By October 1097, the crusade had reached Antioch, one of Christianity's oldest and greatest cities, held by Turks since the 1080s. The siege that followed would last 8 months, testing the Crusaders' resolve, killing thousands through starvation and disease, creating conditions where cannibalism occurred among the desperate. Tancred survived by foraging aggressively, leading raids into the surrounding countryside, taking food and supplies from villages that served the Turkish garrison. He watched his uncle Bohemund maneuver politically while fighting militarily. Bohemund wanted Antioch for himself, not to return it to Byzantium, as his oath required. He used the siege's hardships to discredit Byzantine support, claiming Alexios had abandoned them, turning the other crusade leaders against their supposed ally. When Antioch finally fell through treachery, a Turkish officer opening a gate in exchange for protection, Bohemond moved immediately to claim the city as his own. The march continued to Jerusalem, though many stayed in Antioch under Bohemund's command. Tancred marched on with the reduced crusade force, through Syria and into Palestine, approaching the city that was their spiritual destination. By June 1099, 2 years after leaving Constantinople, the Crusaders beheld Jerusalem's walls. Tancred had seen so much death by this point. Friends lost to disease, comrades killed in battle, civilians slaughtered when cities fell. He had become harder, colder, more ruthless. War had stripped away whatever romantic notions he brought from Italy, leaving only pragmatic violence and calculation. When Jerusalem fell, after 5-week siege, when the Crusaders poured through breached walls and slaughtered Muslims and Jews without discrimination, Tancred participated. The horror of that day, July 15th, 1099, would stain Crusader reputation forever. But to Tancred, hardened by 2 years of constant warfare, it was simply conquest's normal price. He survived to return to the north, to serve under Bohemond in Antioch, to become one of the Principality's most effective military commanders. Years later, looking back on the march east, he would remember it not as pilgrimage, but as the longest, hardest military campaign in Norman history, surpassing William's conquest of England or Robert's conquest of Sicily in sheer endurance required. The march had killed more crusaders than combat. It had transformed idealistic pilgrims into practical conquerors. It had proven once again that Norman military culture, forged in French tournaments and Italian wars, could adapt to any enemy, any terrain, any challenge, the Siege of Antioch. In October 1097, the Crusader army arrived before Antioch's walls and confronted a city that should have been impregnable. Antioch was vast, its walls encompassing over 400 towers built by Byzantine engineers over centuries. The fortifications climbed the slopes of Mount Silpius, making sections of the perimeter nearly inaccessible. The garrison was strong, well supplied, confident they could outlast any siege. The city's governor, Yahisian, had months to prepare after reports reached him of the Crusader approach. He strengthened weak points, expelled the city's Christian population to reduce mouths to feed, and stockpiled supplies. The Crusaders lacked sufficient forces to completely surround the city. They established camps blocking the main gates, but couldn't prevent supplies from entering through mountain gates they couldn't reach. This meant Antioch could be resupplied indefinitely while the Crusaders, dependent on foraging in an increasingly depleted countryside, faced growing hunger. Winter made everything worse. Rain turned camps to mud. Cold killed men who had marched from Western Europe unprepared for Syrian winter conditions. Disease spread through the army. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses killed more Crusaders than Turkish sorties. The siege, expected to last weeks, dragged into months with no resolution visible. Bohemond recognized that military force alone couldn't take Antioch. He needed treachery, needed someone inside to open a gate. He cultivated contacts with the city's Armenian Christians, with Turkish officers who might be bribed, with anyone who could provide access. His patience and political skill, learned watching his father Robert Guiscard, would prove as valuable as his military prowess. By spring 1098, the Crusaders' situation was desperate. Their numbers had declined from 60,000 to perhaps 40,000 through death and desertion. Supply lines from the coast were inadequate. Starvation became reality rather than threat. Men ate horses, leather belts, grass. Some deserted, fleeing back toward Constantinople, preferring dishonor to death from hunger. Even the leaders began doubting success. Into this crisis came news that a massive Muslim relief army was approaching from Mosul, sent to break the siege and destroy the Crusaders. If this army arrived while the Crusaders remained outside Antioch's walls, they would be caught between garrison and relieving force, trapped and slaughtered. The siege had to succeed immediately, or be abandoned. Bohemond moved in the night of June 2nd to 3rd, 1098. An Armenian tower guard named Firuz, whom Bohemond had been cultivating for months, opened a tower gate. Norman warriors scaled the walls in darkness, overwhelming the guard posts, opening gates from inside. The Crusader army poured into Antioch, fighting through streets as the garrison retreated to the inner citadel. The city fell, but the crisis intensified. The Muslim relief army arrived 3 days later, besieging the Crusaders now trapped inside Antioch. The situation had reversed completely. The besiegers became the besieged, holding a city they couldn't defend against superior forces. Still starving, now also facing enemy outside their newly won walls. What saved them was discovery of the Holy Lance, or what was claimed to be the Holy Lance, that pierced Christ's side during crucifixion. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew had visions directing Crusaders to dig in a specific church. They found an iron spearhead. Whether genuine relic or planted fake, it rallied the Crusaders spiritually at their moment of maximum despair. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders sortied from Antioch to face the Muslim army in open battle. They were outnumbered, weakened by starvation, facing fresh enemy forces. But they had endured the impossible siege, had captured impregnable Antioch, believed God fought beside them. The Norman cavalry led the charge, Bohemond commanding, Tancred beside him, smashing into the Muslim lines with desperate fury, born of knowing retreat meant death. The Muslim army broke and fled. The reasons remain debated, perhaps internal dissension among Muslim commanders, perhaps demoralization at seeing a supposedly defeated enemy attack with such ferocity, perhaps divine intervention, as Crusaders believed. The practical result was complete victory. The Siege of Antioch, one of medieval warfare's epics, ended with Crusader triumph, snatched from certain disaster, Bohemond's principality. After Antioch fell and the relief army was defeated, the Crusade leadership faced the question of what to do with the captured city. Byzantine Emperor Alexios expected Antioch returned to imperial control. As the Crusade leaders had sworn, the city had been Byzantine for centuries before Turkish conquest. Restoring it to Byzantium was both legally required by oaths and strategically sensible, ensuring Byzantine support for the Crusade's continuation to Jerusalem. Bohemond refused. He argued that Alexios had abandoned the Crusade, failing to provide promised support during the siege. He claimed his troops had taken Antioch through their own efforts, their own blood, their own suffering through 8 months of hell. Therefore, Antioch was his by right of conquest, regardless of prior oaths. The other Crusade leaders were divided. Some, particularly those from southern France, who had no ties to Norman power politics, supported returning Antioch to Byzantium as sworn. Others, pragmatically, recognized that Bohemond controlled the city's garrison and couldn't be dislodged without civil war among crusaders. They reached uneasy compromise. Bohemond would hold Antioch temporarily. The question of ultimate sovereignty would be resolved later, after Jerusalem was captured. Later never came. Or rather, it came in the form of Bohemond simply keeping what he held. The crusade marched toward Jerusalem without him. Bohemond remained in Antioch with his Italian Norman troops and other warriors who chose to serve under him rather than continue the pilgrimage. He established himself as Prince of Antioch, creating a new Norman state in the Levant, modelled on his father's holdings in Italy. The Principality of Antioch that Bohemond created was quintessentially Norman in character. It maintained Crusader ideology and Latin Christianity as official identity. But it borrowed administrative techniques from Byzantium, military innovations from Muslim enemies, commercial practices from Armenian merchants. Bohemond appointed Norman knights to key positions, but employed Greek, Armenian, and Arab bureaucrats to actually govern, recognizing that conquest required more than military force. The Principality's strategic position was precarious. It existed between Muslim powers to the east and south, Byzantine territory to the west and north, and other Crusader states of uncertain loyalty nearby. Survival required constant warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, and willingness to ally with anyone against anyone. Bohemond proved as skilled at this as his father had been in Italy, playing enemies against each other, maintaining independence through a combination of military strength and political cunning. The relationship with Byzantium remained hostile. Alexios never accepted Bohemond's claim to Antioch, viewing him as an oath-breaking usurper who had stolen Byzantine territory. In 1107, Bohemond returned to Europe to recruit reinforcements, leaving Tancred as regent. He raised an army and attacked Byzantine territory directly, attempting to conquer a path from the Adriatic to Antioch. The campaign failed. Alexios defeated him militarily and diplomatically, forcing a treaty in 1108, where Bohemond theoretically submitted to Byzantine authority, but the treaty meant nothing. Bohemond never returned to Antioch, dying in Italy in 1111. Tancred, ruling as regent, ignored the Byzantine treaty entirely, maintaining Antioch's independence until his death in 1112. Subsequent princes of Antioch would continue Norman policies, holding the principality until 1168, when it finally fell to Muslim conquest. The Principality of Antioch represented Norman expansion at its furthest extent. From Normandy to England to Sicily to the Levant, Norman warriors had conquered territory spanning 3,000 miles, establishing states from the English Channel to the borders of Syria. They had proven themselves history's most successful conquerors, not through superior numbers or resources, but through military excellence, political flexibility, and relentless ambition. Yet even as Bohemond established his principality, the seeds of Norman dissolution were being planted. In England, Norman nobles were intermarrying with English families, adopting English language and customs. In Sicily, Norman identity was being absorbed into the multicultural realm they ruled. In Antioch, far from Normandy, surrounded by foreign peoples, The next generation would be Norman in name only, their culture transformed by their environment. The Normans won everything they fought for, but what they won changed them more than they changed it. The height of Norman power. In the year 1100 AD, stand back and look at what the Normans had accomplished in less than 2 centuries. In Normandy itself, the duchy that Rollo had founded prospered under ducal authority, stronger than the French kings nominally held. Norman castles dotted the landscape. Norman monasteries accumulated wealth and learning. The population spoke French, but retained cultural memory of Norse origins, creating identity that blended both heritages into something unique. In England, William's conquest was consolidated. Norman nobles held every significant position. Norman castles controlled every region. The Domesday Survey had documented William's complete administrative control. England was Norman now, its Anglo-Saxon past becoming memory, its future tied to continental politics and Norman ambitions. The Tower of London, rising in stone, symbolised permanence of Norman rule. In southern Italy and Sicily, the Hauteville brothers had created the most sophisticated Norman state. Robert Guiscard ruled Apulia and Calabria. His brother Roger was completing Sicily's conquest. Their realm was wealthier than England, better administered than Normandy, more culturally complex than anywhere else in Christian Europe. Palermo was becoming a centre of learning, where Greek philosophy met Arab science under Latin Christian patronage. In the Levant, Bohemon's Principality of Antioch extended Norman power into the Middle East. Crusade estates, ruled by Norman lords, stretched from Antioch to Jerusalem. Western military forces occupied territory that had been Muslim for 4 centuries, seemingly reversing the Islamic expansion that had followed Muhammad's death. Measure this achievement against Norman origins. 200 years earlier, they were pagan raiders, Vikings whom Frankish kings paid to go away. Now they ruled kingdoms and principalities from Scotland to Syria. They commanded the finest military forces in the Western world. They held territory comprising perhaps 5 million people, making them demographic equals to France or the Holy Roman Empire. They had transformed medieval Europe's political map more thoroughly than any people since the Romans. The Norman expansion demonstrated several principles about medieval conquest and state building. Military excellence was necessary but insufficient. The Normans won battles through superior cavalry tactics, disciplined formations, and innovative siege warfare, but they held conquests through administrative competence, political flexibility, and willingness to adapt to local conditions. They borrowed Byzantine bureaucracy in Sicily, maintained English administrative structures after conquering England, and created hybrid institutions in Antioch that drew from multiple traditions. Religious sanction proved crucial. The Normans were legitimised by papal support in Italy, by papal blessing for William's English conquest, by crusader ideology in the Levant. They could present their wars as divinely approved, their conquests as service to Christendom. This transformed them from mercenaries and adventurers into defenders of the faith, making their rule acceptable to clerical authorities who might otherwise have opposed secular violence. Demographic reality shaped outcomes. The Normans were never numerous enough to replace conquered populations. In England, perhaps 10,000 Norman settlers ruled a population of 2 million Anglo-Saxons. In Sicily, fewer Normans governed several 100,000 Muslims and Greeks. This forced accommodation, forced preservation of existing social structures, with Norman military force providing top layer of control. The alternative, attempting to impose complete cultural uniformity, would have required genocide beyond even medieval capacity for violence. Yet the very characteristics that made Norman conquests successful contained the seeds of Norman dissolution. Their willingness to adapt meant they absorbed influences from peoples they conquered. Their small numbers meant they had to intermarry with conquered populations. Their political flexibility meant Norman identity became less distinct with each generation. The conquerors were being conquered by their conquests, transformed by the very success that spread them across Europe and the Mediterranean. In 1100, this future remained invisible. The Normans seemed unstoppable, their power still ascending, their conquests still expanding, but the peak was passing even as they celebrated their height. Within 200 years, Norman would be a historical memory, rather than living identity. Their achievements absorbed into the nations they founded, their language and culture dissolved into larger populations they once ruled. They would become the ghosts that haunt medieval history, everywhere and nowhere, triumphant and vanished simultaneously. Legacy in stone and word. The threads unravel. The Norman achievement began its slow unraveling, not through military defeat, but through the quieter processes of inheritance, assimilation, and time. In 1204 AD, King Philip Augustus of France captured Normandy from King John of England. The loss was both symbolic and practical, severing the connection between the duchy that gave the Normans their name and the kingdom they had conquered. Norman nobles who held lands in both England and Normandy were forced to choose allegiance. Most chose England, where their primary holdings lay, effectively abandoning Normandy to French rule. The duchy that Rollo had founded 3 centuries earlier ceased to exist as a distinct entity, absorbed into the expanding French kingdom. The loss revealed something fundamental about Norman identity. Unlike ethnic identities rooted in language or religion, Norman identity was political and military, defined by shared lordship and common military culture, rather than blood or tradition. When that lordship fragmented, when Norman nobles owed allegiance to different kings, the identity began to dissolve. English Norman lords became simply English. French Norman lords became simply French. The word Norman persisted, but increasingly as historical reference, rather than contemporary identity. In England, the transformation happened through marriage and language. Norman nobles, initially speaking French and maintaining continental connections, gradually adopted English customs by necessity. Their wives were often English. Their servants spoke English. Their estates required English-speaking administrators to function. By the mid-1200s, even noble families were using English in daily conversation, reserving French for court and ceremony. The language shift marked deeper cultural absorption. The descendants of William's warriors were becoming English, retaining Norman ancestry as heritage, but not as living identity. Succession crises accelerated the process. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, he divided his holdings between sons, giving Normandy to his eldest Robert, and England to his second son, William Rufus. This separation meant England and Normandy had different rulers, different interests, different trajectories. Though later Norman kings like Henry I would reunite the territories, the precedent of division was established. Each succession risked further fragmentation, further weakening of Norman unity. The Angevin Empire that emerged in the 1200s, ruled by Henry II and his descendants, was Norman in origin, but not Norman in character. It encompassed England, Normandy before its loss, Anjou, Aquitaine, territories spread across France and the British Isles. This was no longer a Norman realm, but a dynastic empire where Norman ancestry was one element among many. Henry II himself was as much Angevin as Norman, his mother Matilda being William the Conqueror's granddaughter, but his identity shaped by multiple inheritances. In Sicily, the process differed, but the outcome was similar. Roger II, who ruled from 1130 to 1154, was the last truly Norman king of Sicily, a man who spoke multiple languages but thought in Norman terms, who employed diverse administrators but maintained Norman military culture. His successors lacked his balance. William I and William II, ruling through the later 1200s, became more Sicilian than Norman, more Mediterranean than Northern European. They favoured Italian advisors, adopted Byzantine court ceremonies, lived in palaces that blended Arab and Greek influences with only surface Norman elements. When the Hauteville line ended with the death of William II in 1189, Sicily passed through marriage to the Hohenstaufen dynasty of Germany. The Norman kingdom became German Empire's possession. The new rulers had no connection to Normandy, no investment in Norman culture, no reason to maintain Norman distinctiveness. Within a generation, Norman Sicily existed only in historical memory, its unique multicultural synthesis persisting but no longer identified with the people who created it. In Antioch, the principality Bohemond founded lasted longer as a political entity, but transformed culturally even more rapidly. Successive princes married Armenian or Byzantine noblewomen, hired Arab or Greek administrators, adopted local customs. By the mid-1200s, the principality was Norman in title only. When it fell to Muslim conquest in 1268, what ended was a Crusader state, not distinctively Norman realm. The unravelling wasn't catastrophic or sudden. No apocalyptic defeat ended Norman civilization. Instead, success itself dissolved them. They conquered so thoroughly, spread so widely, that they became diluted, absorbed, transformed into the peoples they ruled. The very adaptability that made them successful conquerors prevented them from maintaining separate identity. They preserved what they seized, but lost themselves in the preservation. By 1300 AD, Norman as a living identity was essentially extinct. The word survived in place names, in noble genealogies, in historical chronicles, but no one identified primarily as Norman anymore. The transformation from Viking to knight, from raider to ruler, had concluded with a final transformation into Englishman, Frenchman, Italian, a dissolution so complete that even the memory of distinctiveness faded into scholarly footnotes. Stones that remember. You are standing in Durham Cathedral on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the present day, and all around you are Norman voices speaking in stone. The cathedral rises above you, its massive pillars carved with geometric patterns that seem to move in the shadowed light. These pillars were raised between 1093 and 1133, built by Norman masons working for Norman bishops who wanted a church that would awe the unruly north of England into submission. The pillars are cylindrical, some incised with zigzag patterns, others with diamond shapes, still others with vertical fluting. Each one weighs tons, limestone quarried locally and carved with tools not substantially different from Roman implements. Run your hand along the stone, feeling the grooves cut 900 years ago. The mason who carved these lines is dust, his name forgotten, his life unknowable. But his work remains solid and permanent, outlasting empires and languages, and the entire Norman civilization that commissioned it. The stone remembers what flesh forgets. Look up at the ceiling, the ribbed vaulting that seems to float impossibly overhead. This was innovation in the early 1200s, the pointed arch and ribbed vault that would enable Gothic architecture's soaring heights. But Durham's vaults are transitional, still heavy, still Norman in their massive solidity, even as they reach toward new architectural possibilities. The masons were experimenting, learning, discovering through trial and error how stone could be made to defy gravity's pull. Walk slowly through the nave, your footsteps echoing in the vast interior space. Other visitors move quietly, speaking in whispers that the acoustics carry strange distances. A tour guide explains architectural features to a small group, pointing out the rounded arches characteristic of Norman Romanesque style, the alternating pillars that create rhythmic visual pattern down the length of the nave. Her voice is soft, respectful of the space and its history. The light filters through windows high above, creating pools of illumination that shift as clouds pass outside. In Norman times, these windows would have been smaller, the interior darker, the atmosphere more oppressive and mysterious. Later renovations enlarged the windows, letting in more light, but the basic structure remains unchanged. You are seeing essentially what a Norman worshipper would have seen, standing in the same space, looking at the same pillars, feeling the same sense of weight and permanence. Move toward the shrine of St. Cuthbert, Durham's patron saint, whose body was brought here by monks fleeing Viking raids in the late 900s. The Normans built this cathedral around Cuthbert's shrine, recognizing that they needed continuity with Anglo-Saxon past, even as they imposed Norman present. The shrine itself has been rebuilt multiple times, but its location remains constant, the spiritual heart around which the Norman structure was organized. Descend into the crypt, the oldest part of the cathedral, completed by 1193. The space is low and intimate. After the nave's grandeur, the vaulting close overhead, the pillars shorter and thicker. This is pure Norman work, heavy and solid, built to last forever. The air is cooler here, still, quiet in a way that makes you aware of your own breathing. Notice the details the Norman builders included. The carved capitals atop pillars showed geometric patterns, stylized vegetation, occasionally crude figures, or animals. These aren't classical Roman work, refined and naturalistic. They're Norman, powerful, direct, unconcerned with beauty for its own sake, but deeply concerned with visual impact. The message in every line and curve is permanence, authority, the weight of stone expressing the weight of power. Return to the main level and sit in one of the wooden pews, modern additions, but placed where congregations have gathered for 9 centuries. Close your eyes and listen. The cathedral's silence isn't empty, but full, layered with accumulated time, with centuries of prayers and masses and footsteps. If you listen carefully, or imagine listening carefully, you might hear the echoes of Norman voices, French-speaking bishops conducting services, stone masons calling to each other as they worked, the congregation murmuring responses in English to prayers they only partly understood. Open your eyes and look once more at the pillars, the arches, the stone that has stood since the Normans walked these aisles. They are gone, dissolved into history, their language and culture absorbed and lost. But what they built remains, testament to their presence, proof that they existed, evidence written in limestone and carved by hands that turned to dust 900 years ago. The stones remember. The stones keep faith with the forgotten builders who shaped them. The stones will stand long after we too have become dust, holding memory when memory itself has faded beyond recall. The fading of Sicily, Norman Sicily's golden age, that unique multicultural synthesis, Roger II perfected, lasted barely 2 generations after his death. William II, Roger's grandson, died in 1189 without heirs. The kingdom passed to Constance, Roger's daughter, who had married Henry VI of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, ruling Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. Sicily became imperial possession. Its independence ended, its distinctive character gradually overwhelmed by German interests and priorities. The new rulers had different goals than the Normans, where Roger II had valued Sicily for itself, maintaining its multicultural character because it enriched the realm. The Hohenstaufens valued Sicily primarily as a power base for larger imperial ambitions. Frederick II, Constance's son, ruled Sicily brilliantly in the early 1300s, but his kingdom was German imperial creation, not Norman continuation. He spoke Arabic and patronized Arab scholars, yes, but as cosmopolitan emperor, not as Norman king preserving traditional synthesis. The Muslim population that Norman pragmatism had protected faced increasing pressure under later rulers. Christian-Muslim coexistence became less tolerable as European crusading fervour intensified, and religious uniformity became political goal. By the mid-1300s, Sicily's Muslims were being forcibly converted or expelled, ending the three-faith society the Normans had maintained. The Arab craftsmen, scholars, and merchants who had made Sicily prosperous disappeared, taking their knowledge and skills to North Africa or the Middle East. The Greek Orthodox population fared somewhat better, but also faced subordination. The Byzantine Rite churches that Norman rulers had allowed were gradually suppressed or forced to acknowledge papal authority. Greek, as an official language, disappeared from government use. The bilingual inscriptions that had marked Norman public buildings gave way to Latin alone. Cultural diversity became liability rather than asset, something to be eliminated rather than preserved. The physical structures the Normans built remained. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, with its magnificent mosaics blending Norman, Byzantine, and Arab artistic traditions, still stands, still awes visitors with its beauty. The cathedrals at Cefalù and Monreale, massive Norman Romanesque structures decorated with Byzantine gold and Arab geometric patterns, survived centuries largely intact. But the society that created them, the unique Norman synthesis of 3 civilizations, vanished. By 1400, Sicily remembered its Norman past dimly, if at all. The island had been Spanish, then Austrian, always someone's possession, never again independent. The Norman period became historical curiosity, a brief moment when Sicily mattered on European stage, when its kings were powers that popes and emperors had to consider. The memory grew nostalgic, idealized, disconnected from Norman reality of pragmatic conquest and multicultural governance, born from practical necessity rather than philosophical tolerance. Words we still speak. The Norman conquest of England transformed the English language so profoundly that modern English speakers use Norman French words dozens of times daily without knowing their origin. Consider the language you're hearing in this very moment. Words like conquest, language, moment, origin, consider itself, all borrowed from Norman French, entering English in the centuries after 1066, becoming so thoroughly integrated that most English speakers assume they were always part of the language. They weren't. Anglo-Saxon English, before the conquest, had entirely different vocabulary, most of which has vanished from common use, surviving only in archaic texts that require scholarly translation. The pattern of borrowing reveals the social structure of Norman England. Anglo-Saxon words remain for basic, everyday things: hand, foot, house, bread, water, moon, sun, earth, blood, bone. These are the words of common people, peasants and workers, who continued speaking English because Norman conquerors needed them to understand orders and perform labour. The basic vocabulary of survival persisted because it had to, because agriculture and craft work and daily life couldn't wait for linguistic transformation, but move up the social hierarchy, and French words dominate. Government, authority, parliament, justice, court, judge, jury, crime, punishment. Every term related to law and administration comes from Norman French because Normans controlled courts, made laws, dispensed justice. An Anglo-Saxon accused of crime would hear his fate pronounced in French words by French-speaking judges, applying French legal concepts. The vocabulary of power was French because power was Norman. The military terminology is almost entirely French. Army, navy, soldier, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, general, battle, siege, garrison, castle, tower. Lance, armour, shield. Words for shield come from both languages, revealing the overlap. But heraldry, tournament, cavalry, all these are French. The Anglo-Saxon feared militia might have defended their villages, but Norman knights won battles, and their vocabulary won linguistic dominance alongside military victory. Religion provides fascinating complexity. The basic words are English: God, heaven, hell, sin, evil, holy. These concepts existed before Normans arrived, rooted in Anglo-Saxon Christianity that predated William by centuries. But the institutional vocabulary is French: clergy, prayer, parish, abbey, cathedral, communion, salvation. The infrastructure of church hierarchy, brought under Norman control through appointment of Norman bishops, took its terminology from Norman language. Food offers the famous example that linguists love to cite. Living animals retain English names: cow, pig, sheep, chicken, deer. But the meat on noble tables used French names: beef from bœuf, pork from pork, mutton from mouton, poultry from poulet, venison from venaison. The peasants who raised and slaughtered animals spoke English. The nobles who ate them spoke French. You can read England's social hierarchy in its menu, can see the division between labourers and lords, in the space between pig and pork. Architecture and art are overwhelmingly French. Beauty, art, colour, paint, sculpture, column, tower, castle, palace, mansion, chamber, ceiling, floor. While floor has English roots, the associated architectural terminology is French. The physical structures Normans built came with French vocabulary to describe them, vocabulary that English had to borrow, because Anglo-Saxon England had never built on such scale or with such ambition. Abstract concepts increasingly used French words as English evolved. Liberty, justice, honour, courage, mercy, cruelty, pity, joy, grief. These emotional and philosophical terms replaced English equivalents or supplemented them, creating pairs where the French word often seemed more elevated, More formal, English speakers developed habits of using French-derived words for serious or important concepts, English words for casual or common ideas. This created linguistic class distinction within English itself, where word choice signals education and social standing. The borrowing wasn't one-directional or simple. English influenced Norman French as well, particularly in pronunciation and grammar. The French spoken in England diverged from Continental French, becoming Anglo-Norman, a distinct dialect that Continental French speakers mocked as corrupted and provincial. By 1300, England's nobility was speaking English again, but an English transformed by 2 centuries of French influence. An English that was no longer the language of Beowulf, but something new, hybrid, neither purely Germanic nor purely Romance, but uniquely English. Modern English vocabulary is roughly 30% French in origin, a higher percentage than any other non-Romance language. Every time you speak, every time you write, you use Norman words, continue Norman influence, perpetuate linguistic conquest that happened 1,000 years ago. The Normans dissolved as a people, but their language persists in yours, in ours, in every English sentence ever spoken or written. They won linguistic immortality through conquest's unintended consequence. Consider this further. The words you use to think about history, culture, society, language itself, nearly all are French-derived. Historian comes from French histoire, culture from French culture, society from French société, language from French langue. The very vocabulary we use to discuss Norman influence is itself Norman influence, self-referential proof of how thoroughly they transformed English civilization. The Anglo-Saxon language didn't disappear, but was buried under French additions, re-emerging transformed, enriched or corrupted, depending on perspective, but fundamentally changed. When you speak English, you speak a Norman English hybrid, a living monument to conquest more enduring than any castle, more permanent than any stone cathedral. The Normans built with stone, but their most lasting construction was linguistic, words that will persist as long as English is spoken, carrying their legacy in every syllable, in every conversation, in every thought expressed through this strange, beautiful, mongrel language they helped create. The last Normans. His name was Robert de Beaumont, and he was the last man in his family to call himself Norman without irony or hesitation. Born in 1223 in Leicestershire, England, Robert was descended from one of William the Conqueror's companions who had fought at Hastings. His family held lands in England for 6 generations, maintained connections to Normandy despite its loss to France, spoke French at home and in their private chambers. Robert's father had fought in King John's wars, served Henry III loyally, did everything expected of a Norman noble in England, but Robert noticed changes his father either didn't see or refused to acknowledge. His childhood friends, sons of other Norman noble families, were learning English as their first language rather than second. They spoke French poorly, with accents their Continental relatives mocked. They married into English families without the reluctance earlier generations had shown. They were becoming English, and Robert understood this, even as a boy, watching his world transform. He studied at Oxford, that growing centre of learning, where lectures were delivered in Latin, but conversations happened increasingly in English. The great families sent their sons there to gain education, to make connections, to prepare for service to king and realm. Robert's classmates included sons of old Norman families and sons of English families, elevated by royal favour. The distinction mattered less each year. Robert served in Henry III's administration, working on legal documents, helping manage royal estates, performing the bureaucratic work that kept government functioning. He wrote in Latin and French, but conversed increasingly in English, because practical administration required communication with English-speaking officials, English-speaking peasants, English-speaking merchants. The language of power was shifting, or rather expanding, no longer exclusively French but bilingual at minimum, trilingual if you counted Latin's continued ceremonial use. He married in 1248, and this was where his family's Norman identity truly ended. His father wanted him to marry a Norman noblewoman, preferably with French lands to maintain continental connections. But the available Norman brides were few, and the ones with French lands demanded dowries Robert's family couldn't provide. He married instead Catherine, daughter of an English knight whose family had risen to prominence through administrative service. She was gentle, educated, speaking French well enough for social occasions, but thinking in English. Her cultural reference points entirely English, despite her fluency in aristocratic language. Their children, born in the 1250s, learned English and French simultaneously but preferred English. They spoke French when their grandfather visited, performed the linguistic duty expected of noble children, but reverted to English immediately after. For them, Norman was grandfather's word, something old and fading, not current identity. They were English, though English of Norman descent, the distinction growing finer with each passing year. Robert watched his father die in 1263, the old man insisting until the end that the family was Norman, would always be Norman, must preserve Norman heritage against English dilution. Robert said the words his father wanted to hear, promised to maintain the old ways, to teach his children French, to remember Hastings and the conquest and the glory of Norman arms. But he knew, had known for years, that he was promising something already lost. When his own children grew to adulthood and began their own lives, Robert stopped fighting the transformation. He was English. His children were English. Norman was their ancestry, their heritage, something to remember and honour, but no longer living identity. The language had changed. The culture had changed. The world had changed. Trying to preserve Norman distinctiveness was fighting against time itself, and time was undefeated. Robert died in 1289, old by medieval standards, having lived through his family's final transformation. His will, written in French by habit but understood primarily through English translation, divided his English estates among English heirs who would speak English to English wives and raise English children. The last Norman was dead. What remained was memory, and memory was fading faster than Robert would have believed possible. Ghosts in the landscape. England's landscape is haunted by Norman presence, written in stone and earth, and the shapes of settlements that persist centuries after builders vanished. Castle ruins dot the countryside, motte and bailey earthworks visible from aerial photographs, grass-covered mounds where wooden towers once stood. Durham, Windsor, Dover, dozens of major castles still occupied, still maintained, tourist attractions now, but originally instruments of conquest and control. The stone keeps rise heavy and square. Norman Romanesque architecture that valued solidity over elegance, power over beauty. They were built to last forever, and many have, outlasting the civilization that raised them. Drive through the English countryside, and every few miles you'll pass through a village with Norman church, the rounded arches of the doorway unmistakable, the solid tower built to serve as last refuge if the village came under attack. These churches are still used, still hold services, connecting modern congregations to medieval worshippers through continuous line of prayer stretching back 900 years. The stones have heard Latin masses, English prayers, centuries of human hope and grief and thanksgiving. The field systems still follow boundaries the Normans established, property lines drawn in the Domesday Survey and maintained through all subsequent centuries. English law of property derives from Norman innovations, concepts of lordship and tenancy and inheritance that William's administrators imposed, and which became so fundamental to English society that their Norman origin was forgotten. You live with Norman legal concepts. If you live under English common law, carry Norman ideas about ownership and obligation in contemporary property transactions. Place names preserve Norman presence in fragments. Beaumont, Mandeville, Montgomery, names that were French once, are English now, pronounced by people who don't think about their foreign origin. The landscape itself was renamed in places, Norman lords giving French names to English villages, creating linguistic palimpsest, where Anglo-Saxon and Norman French overlay each other, both visible to anyone who knows how to read the ancient text of place names. Walk through London and you walk past the Tower, that massive Norman keep William built to awe the capital into submission. It still stands, solid and grim, housing the crown jewels now, tourist destination rather than fortress, but its silhouette unchanged. The White Tower, as the central keep is called, looks exactly as it did in William's day, limestone walls, thick enough to shrug off any medieval siege engine, narrow windows admitting minimal light, every design choice sacrificing comfort for defensive strength. Visit the countryside, cathedrals, Norwich and Durham, and Ely and Winchester and Canterbury, massive structures that represent Norman builders' most ambitious achievements. They were showing off, demonstrating capability that exceeded any military need, proving that Norman civilization could create beauty alongside brutality. The cathedrals are quiet now, peaceful, places of contemplation and prayer. But they were built in conquest's wake, assertions of permanent Norman presence, stones shaped to declare that these foreign lords intended to stay forever. The ghosts are everywhere, if you know where to look. Remnants of a people who conquered so thoroughly their works persist while their identity dissolved. They built for eternity and achieved it, not through their bloodlines or culture, but through stone and earth, and the permanent changes they imposed on landscape and law. England is their monument, built and shaped and transformed by Norman hands, haunted not by spectral presence but by physical permanence of what they made. The paradox revisited. In 911 AD, Rollo traded his identity as a Viking for legitimacy as a Christian duke, accepting baptism and land in exchange for renouncing the culture that made him. His descendants, through 7 generations, completed that transformation, becoming Normans, something new and unprecedented, neither Norse nor Frankish, but a synthesis of both. Then they repeated the process, conquering England and becoming English, conquering Sicily and becoming Sicilian, conquering Antioch, and dissolving into the Levantine mixture of crusader and native. Each conquest transformed the conquerors as much as the conquered. Each success contained the seeds of dissolution. They won everything they sought and lost themselves completely in the winning. This was the Norman paradox. Their greatest strength was their fatal weakness. Adaptability made them successful conquerors, but prevented them from maintaining separate identity. Small numbers meant they had to preserve and work within existing systems, but this preserved contact with conquered peoples ensured cultural exchange, intermarriage, gradual absorption. Pragmatism served them brilliantly in the short term, building states that functioned and prospered, but pragmatism meant abandoning distinctiveness whenever utility demanded. They lasted as a distinct people for roughly 300 years. From Rollo's baptism in 911 to the early 1300s, when the last identifiably Norman institutions and cultural practices faded into the nations they had. Founded, 3 centuries is long for a culture born from cultural collision, shorter than they surely hoped when building cathedrals meant to stand forever. Compare them to other conquerors across history. The Romans conquered and imposed Roman law, Roman language, Roman culture on their subjects, lasting 1,000 years through cultural imperialism that transformed conquered peoples into Romans. The Arabs conquered and spread Islam, Arab cultural practices, creating civilization that persisted through multiple dynasties and political transformations. The Normans conquered and dissolved, leaving laws and language and buildings but not themselves, not a Norman nation or Norman people or Norman culture that survived conquest's success. Perhaps they were too few, spread too thin across too much geography. Perhaps they were too willing to marry outside their community, too quick to adopt useful customs from their subjects. Perhaps their identity was too shallow, based more on shared military culture and political allegiance than on deep ethnic or religious foundations that could survive dispersion and intermarriage. Or perhaps they simply succeeded too completely. They conquered England so thoroughly that they became England. They mastered Sicily so effectively that they became Sicilian. The conquered peoples didn't disappear, but rather absorbed the conquerors, the larger population overwhelming the smaller through the simple mathematics of marriage and birth, and cultural transmission across generations. There's something almost poetic about this dissolution. They began as Vikings, who abandoned their identity to gain land. They ended as Normans, who abandoned their identity through the very success of their conquests. Transformation defined them from beginning to end, the constant across 3 centuries being their willingness to become something else when advantage demanded. They were the ultimate pragmatists, sacrificing permanence for success, choosing effectiveness over continuity. The question they leave behind is whether they succeeded or failed. They achieved every military objective, conquered kingdoms, built structures that still stand, transformed medieval Europe's political map, but they ceased to exist as a people, leaving no Norman nation, no Norman language, no Norman culture that modern descendants can claim. Were they history's most successful conquerors, or its most successful disappearance? The answer depends on how you measure success, whether through achievement or continuity, whether through what they won or what they lost in the winning. Perhaps the answer is that they succeeded and failed simultaneously, that these are not opposites, but 2 aspects of the same process. They won everything and lost everything. They changed the world and were changed by it. They built for eternity and vanished like morning mist. This is their paradox, their triumph, and their tragedy, written in the stones that remember them and the words we speak without knowing their origin. Legacy written in stone. The Normans are gone, but what they built remains, written in stone and law and language, permanent beyond their wildest dreams despite their complete dissolution as a people. Every English-speaking person carries Norman legacy in their vocabulary, using French-derived words dozens of times daily, speaking a language transformed by conquest so thoroughly that its Anglo-Saxon roots are often unrecognizable beneath Norman additions. The law you live under, if you live in England, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, any common law jurisdiction, descends from Norman legal innovations. Concepts about property and inheritance and judicial process that William's administrators imposed on England and which spread through British Empire to modern world. The buildings they raise still stand, still inspire awe, still function 900 years after construction. Durham Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, the Tower of London, dozens of lesser-known churches and castles and monasteries, all testimony to Norman architectural ambition and engineering skill. These structures have outlasted empires, survived wars and revolutions, and the complete transformation of society multiple times over. They will likely stand another 1,000 years, carrying Norman legacy into futures those builders couldn't imagine. The political institutions they created evolved but retained fundamental characteristics. The centralized monarchy William imposed on England, stronger than the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdom that preceded it, became the framework for modern British government. The administrative innovations, the written records, the systematic taxation, the professional bureaucracy, all these evolved into contemporary governmental structures that function according to principles Norman administrators would recognize, even if the details would baffle them. Their military innovations changed warfare permanently. The cavalry charge they perfected became standard European tactic for centuries. The castle-building expertise they developed, the strategic use of fortifications to control territory, these influenced military thought long after Norman identity disappeared. Modern military academies still teach lessons from Norman campaigns, still study Hastings as an example of how cavalry defeats infantry, how tactical flexibility wins battles. The cultural synthesis they created, particularly in Sicily, demonstrated possibilities that wouldn't be fully explored for centuries. The idea that different faiths and cultures could coexist under single government, that diversity could be strength rather than weakness, that pragmatism could create functional, multicultural society. These concepts were radical in medieval Europe. Norman Sicily proved them possible, even if later rulers abandoned the experiment. The legacy waits in history for future generations to rediscover and perhaps implement more successfully. Their very disappearance teaches valuable lessons. They demonstrate that conquest without cultural imperialism leads to absorption rather than dominance, that small conquering populations will inevitably be overwhelmed by larger conquered populations if intermarriage and cultural exchange are allowed. They show that adaptability and pragmatism, however useful tactically, cannot preserve distinct identity across generations. They prove that building eternal monuments doesn't ensure eternal memory, that stone outlasts culture, that what you make can survive what you are. Tonight, we have traced the Normans from Viking raiders to Christian knights, from landless adventurers to kings and princes, from conquest to dissolution. We have watched them transform themselves repeatedly, abandoning identity for opportunity, succeeding brilliantly and vanishing completely. We have seen their greatest triumphs and their inevitable absorption into the peoples they conquered. We have walked through their cathedrals and spoken their words without knowing their origin. They won everything. They lost everything. They changed the world permanently while ceasing to exist. This is their story, their paradox, their legacy written in stone and word and law, permanent monuments to a people who are remembered and forgotten, simultaneously, everywhere and nowhere, triumphant and vanished. Thank you for trusting me to guide you through these historical reveries. May these echoes from the past have gently carried you toward dreams. Rest well beneath the starlit skies of ancient nights.